Freedom is a word so deeply etched into the identity of the modern West that its shape feels permanent, almost sacred. It is printed in constitutions, echoed in protests, and marketed in the language of everything from social media platforms to consumer goods. Yet, as we race through an era of data mining, predictive algorithms, and quietly eroding privacy, we must ask, have we only changed the shape of the cage? Have we traded physical chains for psychological ones, or replaced old hierarchies with subtler forms of domination that are more difficult to see because they are internalized, digitized, and sanitized? It is this shadowy uncertainty that makes the question, was ancient society more free than ours, so provocative. At first glance, the answer appears simple. Of course not. Ancient societies were brutal, hierarchical, and deeply unequal. Slavery was ubiquitous. Women were silenced. The poor were crushed beneath the weight of inherited power. But such sweeping condemnations are too clean, too confident. They ignore the possibility that freedom, as a lived experience, might have taken forms unfamiliar to us, forms that elude the legalistic definitions we cling to today. If freedom means the capacity to live without surveillance, to move without documentation, to speak without fear of digital memory, then perhaps the ancients lived closer to it than we do in certain respects. We must step carefully here, for romanticizing the past is no more honest than worshipping the present. But something happens when you strip a life of bureaucracy and abstraction. A barefoot citizen of Athens could walk into the assembly and vote, debate, accuse, and ridicule the elite in ways few modern people dare to attempt in their sanitized workplaces or censored online feeds. A desert-dwelling tribe could roam the land without passports, health apps, or credit scores, free from the ghostly paperwork that defines our existence. Even the social outcasts of Rome and Egypt sometimes found ways to express their identities, beliefs, and resistance without the fear of being stobaned, fired by HR departments, or locked in echo chambers where dissent dies unnoticed. And yet, these same people could also be tortured, enslaved, or executed without trial. Women in Athens, for all their proximity to democracy, were not considered citizens. A slave in Sparta might be killed for sport. So how could we dare suggest that any of them were freer than we are? The answer lies not in denial, but in nuance, by asking what kind of freedom was available, to whom, and under what conditions. Modern life guarantees certain protections. We do not fear arbitrary crucifixion. Most of us enjoy legal rights. We have access to medical care, education, and global information. But in exchange, we are also processed, categorized, and constantly monitored, our thoughts sculpted by invisible hands, our movements tracked by machines, our social roles enforced not by brute force but by algorithms. Consider the concept of freedom as autonomy, the ability to make decisions about one's life without coercion. In ancient times, this autonomy was often constrained by rigid social roles. But within those roles, certain individuals had wide latitude. A Roman citizen could refuse military service, insult a magistrate, or worship strange gods without necessarily being cast out. Modern citizens, though nominally freer, often find themselves bound by debts, regulations, and social expectations that leave little room for deviation. A person today might legally change gender, religion, or profession, but doing so often invites a labyrinth of paperwork, suspicion, and cultural backlash. Autonomy exists, but it is fenced in by invisible walls that didn't always exist in the past. This is not to claim that ancient life was more just. Justice and freedom are cousins, not twins. The ancient world was often monstrously unjust, but injustice does not always preclude freedom. An Egyptian peasant might be exploited, but he could also vanish into the desert, worship in secret, or escape the notice of the state entirely luxuries rarely afforded to modern citizens. We live in a time when vanishing is nearly impossible. The state knows our GPS coordinates. Corporations know our desires before we do. Even dissent is commodified and sold back to us in the form of hashtags, documentaries, or edgy brands. This essay will not argue that we should trade one world for the other, but it will unsettle the illusion that history has moved in a single, upward direction toward ever greater freedom. It will ask us to reconsider our certainty. It will invite us to see freedom not as a single treasure unlocked by democracy or modernity, but as a shape-shifting ideal sometimes brightest in the most unexpected corners of human history. Because the question is not merely whether ancient people were free. The question is whether our definition of freedom is itself a form of imprisonment. If we define it only in terms of laws and rights, we ignore the ways our thoughts and desires are managed. If we define it as consumer choice, we obscure how little those choices really matter. If we define it as self-expression, we forget how often that expression is surveilled, judged, and punished in ways that are no less chilling than a Roman censor, only quieter and wrapped in the language of safety, decency, and terms of service. So we begin here not with a nostalgia for a mythical golden age, nor with a smug declaration of progress, but with a question that stings more than it soothes. Was ancient society more free than ours? And if it was, in some vital, invisible way, then what does that say about the freedom we believe we possess? As we journey into the lives of ancient people, the Athenian citizens, Mesopotamian traders, Celtic warriors, Roman slaves, tribal nomads, temple priestesses, we will examine not just their constraints, but their possibilities. We will look at the way power was distributed, how people resisted it, how identities were shaped, and how spiritual life sometimes offered escape when society did not. Each culture will be held against the mirror of our own, not to elevate one over the other, but to expose what both conceal. Because freedom is never simple. It is never universal. It is never permanent. But it is always there, hidden between the cracks of daily life, sometimes glowing faintly in the eyes of a runaway slave, sometimes roaring in the voice of a woman who refuses her role, sometimes whispering from the past to remind us that what we call freedom may only be another word for obedience, disguised before cities carved their silhouettes against the sky, before kings mounted thrones and declared divine rule, before the word freedom had even taken shape in the mouths of poets. There existed a way of life so embedded in the rhythm of the earth that it hardly needed a name. It was not utopian, nor free of violence or hardship, but it moved differently. It was human life in its rawest political form, decentralized, adaptive, and alarmingly unconcerned with hierarchy. This is where the question of freedom must begin, not in the ruins of empires or the scrolls of philosophers, but in the silent forests, grassy plains, and river-crossed valleys where small groups of people lived and made choices together without needing to beg permission from distant rulers or consult bureaucratic scripts to step into the world of Upper Paleolithic and early Neolithic societies. Is to be reminded that for the vast majority of human history, over 95%, we lived in bands and tribes. These were not primitive in the way 19th century anthropologists once scoffed. They were radically adaptive social forms, often based on cooperation, oral memory, and shared responsibility. In many of these groups, decisions were made collectively. Elders offered guidance, but leadership rotated or was situational. Charisma and practicability mattered more than lineage. There were no prisons. No one policed thoughts. Kinship networks served both as safety nets and political units, with consensus more valuable than conquest. Freedom, in such a context, wasn't theoretical, it was embedded in the absence of institutions that could overrule the group or the individual. If someone disagreed with the majority, they could leave. There was space. There were no borders, no IDs, no taxes to dodge, no records kept of your behavior unless it was woven into a story retold beside the fire. If someone violated social norms, they might be ridiculed, ostracized, or, in rare cases, killed. But there was no surveillance, no judiciary hierarchy, no central archive of guilt or reputation. In this sense, the very structure of these societies made room for a kind of practical autonomy nearly unimaginable today. People moved with the season, with their kin, with their desires. No one was a stranger to land or law, because land was shared and law was unwritten. This autonomy extended across gender in ways that later civilizations would systematically dismantle. Evidence from burial sites, tool distribution, and skeletal remains suggests that in many Upper Paleolithic groups, labor was shared across lines of sex in far more flexible ways than classical civilizations allowed. Women hunted, men gathered. Both participated in ritual, trade, and storytelling. The sacred feminine was not marginal but central in many early belief systems. This does not mean full equality as we define it today, but it points to a social arrangement in which rigid gender hierarchies had not yet crystallized. A woman's role was not locked by law, and her sexuality was not regulated by property or dowry. Children belonged to the group. Kinship was often matrilineal. Shame had not yet been codified into morality. There is, of course, a tendency to romanticize tribal life, to paint it as noble and pure. This would be a mistake. Violence existed. Group rivalries could erupt in deadly conflict. There was no immunity from pain, illness, or hunger. Life was often short and security fragile. But these conditions did not negate the deeply embedded freedoms that came from small-scale living. In fact, what seems to define these societies most profoundly is the way they prevented the accumulation of coercive power. Mechanisms of leveling humor, gossip, ridicule, and the threat of walking away kept would-be tyrants in check. In a band of 30 or 40 people, it is very difficult to rule by force for long. Reputation was everything, but it was earned through generosity and skill, not inherited or bought. Some anthropologists refer to these societies as fiercely egalitarian, not because they were peaceful, but because they took active measures to prevent inequality from hardening into structure. This can be seen in groups as diverse as the Kong of the Kalahari, the Inuit of the Arctic, or the Hadza of Tanzania, modern echoes of ancient lifeways. In these communities, no one hoards food without losing status. Boasting is met with laughter, not praise. When a hunter returns with a kill, he downplays it. The meat is distributed. Reciprocity, not competition, sustains social bonds. The individual is free, but that freedom is anchored in communal responsibility, not out of law, but because survival depends on it. You are free to go your own way, but you are also expected to return the favor when the balance shifts. Freedom here is not atomized. It is relational. Language, too, reflects this orientation. Many tribal languages lack words for please or thank you because generosity is not framed as a favor, it is a social duty. This linguistic nuance hints at a moral framework in which freedom is not defined against others but exists through them. The self is not isolated but interwoven. To choose for oneself is not to cut away from the group but to participate fully within it. There are no contracts, only expectations. No police, only memory. No prisons, only exile, which is punishment. Enough when the group is everything. As the Neolithic Revolution emerged, bringing with it settled agriculture, domestication, and denser populations, these fluid structures began to change. Sedentism made it harder to walk away. The granary had to be protected. Surplus invited theft. Hierarchy crept in, not as conspiracy but as consequence. Someone had to manage the storehouse. Someone else managed the water. Someone else organized the labor. The web of shared responsibility began to stratify. The egalitarian instinct, so hardwired in mobile foragers, struggled to adapt to immobile settlements. And yet, for a long time, early agricultural villages maintained a surprising degree of horizontal organization. Çatalhöyük, one of the world's oldest known towns in what is now Turkey, shows no obvious signs of centralized authority. Homes are uniform, shrines are domestic, art flourished. No temples loom over the village. It suggests that people still made decisions together, still held their lives in common, even as they put down roots. But the seeds of hierarchy had been sown. Once populations exceeded the point where everyone could know each other face to face, new mechanisms were needed to enforce order. Formal rules, leadership roles, guarded boundaries. The freedom of walking away was no longer practical. Now you had to stay. You had to negotiate. You had to comply with emerging norms that no longer came from shared memory, but from authority. In many places, this transition took thousands of years. In others, it was more abrupt. But in all cases, the tribal core began to disappear, but diminish, tucked away in remote corners or folded into myths of a freer past. Still, something remained. Even as cities rose and kings proclaimed themselves divine, the memory of another kind of life lingered. Oral traditions preserved stories of a time when people moved with the wind and lived without masters. Rebellions often invoked these memories. Prophets called for a return to older ways. The tribal world, though pushed aside, continued to haunt. Civilization, offering a contrasting rhythm, one rooted not in conquest, but in connection. We should not misunderstand what this freedom meant. It was not freedom from labor or danger or pain. It was not the sanitized liberty of legal codes or the abstract rights of the modern state. It was a different kind of freedom from structure, from surveillance, from the machinery of power that tells you who you are and what you must do. It was the freedom to disappear if needed, to refuse, to laugh at power rather than obey it, to live small but live whole. Today, we often mistake the presence of choice for the presence of freedom. But in these early societies, choice was constrained. In some ways and yet widened in others. You could not shop for identities. You could not tweet your rage. But you could exist without being measured, categorized, or monetized. Your thoughts were your own unless shared aloud. Your labor served your group, not a distant elite. No HR department managed your personality. No algorithm sorted your preferences. There was no audience, only the circle around the fire. This is not to claim that tribal societies offer a model we can return to. They were products of their time, their environment, their scale. But they remind us that freedom does not always require complexity, that simpler societies are not necessarily more repressive, that the centralization of power, while efficient, often narrows the soul. In the tribal world, freedom meant living inside your body, your land, your kin knot, your profile, or your productivity. And so the contrast begins to sharpen. As we journey forward into the rise of civilizations and the hardening of hierarchies, we must carry this image with us, not as a fantasy, but as a standard, a way to measure what was lost in the name of progress. A whisper from the forest, asking if all that came after was really better or simply louder. As the delicate balance of the tribal world began to shift under the pressures of settlement, population density, and the taming of rivers and grain, something irreversible took root. The rhythms of seasonal movement gave way to permanence. With agriculture came accumulation. With accumulation, storage. With storage, theft. And with theft, the need for protection, real or imagined. Slowly, in the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates, and along the predictable course of the Nile, the foundations of the state emerged not suddenly, not cleanly, but like sediment layering over time, thickening into institutions. Here, for the first time in human history, freedom began to meet its enduring rival. Administration. It did not happen everywhere at once. Sumer and Egypt represent two of the earliest known expressions of this new model, and yet they offered distinct variations in how control crystallized from cooperation. What they shared, however, was a decisive transformation of the relationship between individuals and their environment. In place of flexible kinship bonds and oral memory stood written law, permanent hierarchy, and centralized authority cloaked in sacred myth. The gods now had offices, priests had quotas, and kings began to speak not just for themselves but on behalf of the entire cosmos. In Sumer, the earliest city-states such as Uruk and Ur emerged as dense concentrations of humanity that required a level of coordination previously unnecessary in small-scale tribal life. Canals needed maintenance, fields had to be allotted, surplus grain had to be measured and guarded. None of this could function through informal consensus alone. The solution was both ingenious and profound, the invention of writing not for poetry but for accounting. Cuneiform tablets, the ancestors of all bureaucratic systems, were not born of philosophy but of barley and sheep. They recorded transactions, temple offerings, land boundaries, debts, and taxes, writing aloud a new kind of memory, one that did not fade with age or death. But it also introduced a new kind of control. Once your labor was recorded, it could be demanded. Once your land was measured, it could be taxed. Once your name was etched in clay, you could not vanish so easily. Freedom in the Sumerian city was not extinguished, but it was narrowed. Individuals were now defined by their role in the state's machinery. A man was a farmer, a soldier, a craftsman, each position entailing obligations not just to kin but to temple and crown. The temple itself became a nexus of spiritual and economic power, managing land, labor, and ritual. The gods demanded grain and silver, and it was the bureaucracy that ensured their appetites were met. One did not simply give thanks to the divine in private. One paid tribute, worked temple lands, obeyed calendars set by priest astronomers. Religion became public, ordered, mandatory, no longer a fluid set of beliefs negotiated within the tribe, but a regulated duty inscribed in law. Yet, even in this tightening web, there were compensations. The state brought a kind of security that tribal life could not always guarantee. The granaries of yore could feed the city in lean seasons. Walls could repel raiders. Laws, however, brutal, provided predictability. The famous Code of Urnamu, predating Hammurabi's by centuries, offered written standards of justice, including compensation for injury, rules on inheritance, and procedures for property disputes. In theory, this was a form of equality rules applied to all. In practice, the application was deeply stratified, favoring the elite, male, and freeborn. But it was beginning a transformation of violence from arbitrary vengeance to institutionalized penalty. Egypt followed a parallel path with its own distinctions. Where Sumer was a patchwork of competing cities, Egypt evolved more quickly into a centralized kingdom under the pharaohs. The Nile's geography encouraged unity, predictable flooding, navigable waters, and natural boundaries made coordination more feasible. The result was one of history's most enduring states, stretching millennia. Here too, freedom contracted under the weight of divine kingship. The pharaoh was not merely ruler, but God incarnate, his will indistinguishable from cosmic order. His authority, the literal breath of Mat, the principle of balance and justice. But unlike Sumer, where city elites vied for influence, Egypt's consolidation allowed for a more cohesive identity. The average peasant in Middle Kingdom Egypt might never meet the pharaoh, but he belonged to a world imagined as orderly, sacred, and eternal. Life was seasonal and ceremonial. Taxes were paid in kind labor on temples, grain from fields, service in military or corvée projects, but in exchange, one received protection from famine, war, and the chaos beyond the desert. Hierarchy was rigid, but it had meaning. One's place in the cosmos was not accidental but purposeful, inscribed in myth and reinforced in art, ritual, and architecture. Freedom under this system was not autonomy but stability. You were free in the sense that you knew your role, your gods, your duties. This might seem alien to modern liberal definitions, but for many ancient Egyptians, it was deeply reassuring. Chaos, the feared enemy of all things, was banished by order, and order was maintained through submission. To obey was not civility. It was participation in the ongoing act of creation. Even death, that great frontier of fear, was mapped, ritualized, and supplied with instructions for safe passage. The state became a machine for denying disorder, not only in life, but beyond it. That said, even in this controlled environment, acts of resistance and moments of autonomy occurred. Laborers carving tombs in the Valley of the Kings left behind graffiti mocking their overseers. Peasants lodged complaints about unjust treatment. Local officials occasionally defied royal orders. There was no illusion of total control. But the system absorbed rebellion by making it the exception, not the rule. The pyramids did not stand merely because of oppression, but because the state was able to organize, mythologize, and reward loyalty on an unprecedented scale. What is striking in both Sumer and Egypt is how bureaucracy became the new terrain on which freedom was measured. No longer the freedom to walk away, but the freedom to petition, to appeal, to be acknowledged by the system. To be written down in clay or papyrus was both a sign of control and a strange kind of protection. Your grievance could be preserved, your land claim recorded, your lineage remembered. The very tools of surveillance doubled as tools of legacy. This duality would echo through every state that followed, the archive as both shackle and shield, and so freedom changed. It was no longer the absence of structure, but the management of one's place within it. A citizen of yore might not have the liberty to refuse taxation, but he might gain access to trade, to priestly favor, or to temple feasts. An Egyptian farmer could not wander the land without consequence, but he might live without fear of sudden death or starvation. This was a negotiated freedom, conditional, partial, yet more predictable than the volatility of stateless life. The cost, however, was intimacy. No longer did individuals define themselves solely through kin or story. They were now tax units, military quotas, census entries. The state knew them, not by affection but by category. You were male or female, peasant or priest, debtor or freeholder. You had obligations, and those obligations came with deadlines and overseers. The shift from fluid to fixed identity was profound. The moment you could be summoned by name and held accountable to a ledger, you were no longer invisible, and yet this visibility was not entirely a loss. It brought with it a strange dignity. In the tribal world, your story died with those who remembered it. In the state, it could be etched in stone, immortalized in stele or scroll. A humble man could leave behind a complaint carved into a wall. A woman might be named in a legal contract. A merchant could record his trade route for posterity. The state offered not only control but continuity. This transformation was not merely political but psychological. The internal world of individuals began to adapt to these new structures. Obedience was no longer merely fear of punishment, but belief in order. Myth became ideology. The gods did not just live in nature, they sat on thrones. The pharaoh was not merely a man, but a mediator of divine will. The scribes, though few in number, became gatekeepers of reality. To write was to define was to limit, and yet, through this limitation came civilization. We do not need to idealize the tribal past to recognize what was lost. The early states curtailed mobility, suppressed dissent, and began the long process of turning communities into hierarchies. But they also constructed frameworks of memory, justice, and infrastructure that allowed culture to flourish in new ways. Literature, monumental architecture, calendar systems, mathematics all depended on the bureaucratic logic of the state. Freedom, in this context, was redefined as the ability to participate in this collective vision, to live within its order, speak its language, believe its stories. The deeper irony is that many of the structures we associate with modern legal protections, identity documents, civic roles have their origins in these ancient controls. The passport is a descendant of the tax register. The court of law emerges from the temple decree. The civil servant is the great-grandchild of the scribe. We have taken the tools of surveillance and ritualized them into symbols of liberation. But the lineage is undeniable. So we must ask, is the modern citizen any freer than the ancient subject, or simply more entangled in subtler chains? The tribal core offered freedom through absence of coercion, of hierarchy, of permanence. The ancient state offered freedom through presence, of identity, of shared myth. Both were incomplete. Both answered different needs. But the birth of the state marked the end of freedom as it had once been known. From here on, autonomy would be negotiated, not assumed. And every act of rebellion, every demand for rights, would occur within the structures that first emerged in the mud-brick temples of Sumer and the limestone tombs of Egypt, as the administrative structures of the early state matured into rigid hierarchies and sacred kingship. They left in their wake a complicated legacy. Egypt and Sumer had offered protection through control, security through submission. But further west, in the rugged terrain of Attica, a different experiment began to take form, one that promised a new kind of freedom, born not from divinity or bureaucracy, but from speech, contest, and the strange magic of collective will. Classical Athens, by the 5th century BCE, had crafted a political model that even today exerts gravitational pull on the modern imagination. Democracy, as it was first practiced there, did not merely imply voting, it meant direct participation in the daily choreography of power, and yet this luminous vision of civic freedom rested, unapologetically, on a foundation of systemic exclusion, exploitation, and violence. The Athenian ideal was both real and rotten, transcendent and hypocritical, radical and brutal. It is this contradiction that defines the Athenian illusion, that freedom could exist fully, but only for a few, that the right to rule oneself and one's polis was not a universal inheritance, but a guarded privilege carved out of the subjugation of others. To understand the freedoms of Athens, one must first reckon with those it silenced. Athenian democracy extended its blessings to a very particular class of people, free, landowning, adult males born to Athenian parents. That was the sacred circle. Everyone else, women, slaves, metics, resident foreigners, children, existed within the city, but outside its political soul. They were subject to its laws, contributed to its economy, bled for its wars, but had no formal voice in the assembly, no vote in the courts, no standing in the debates that shaped their lives. This was not a glitch in the system. Was the system a democracy defined by its exclusions as much as by its principles? And yet, within that narrow circle, the freedom available to the Athenian citizen was astonishing. He could speak freely. In the ecclesia, where policy was crafted not by representatives but by the people themselves, he could propose laws, challenge generals, sue aristocrats, ridicule politicians in public festivals. The courts were populated by randomly selected jurors who decided cases without judges. Political office was accessible by lottery rather than vote, a design intended to prevent domination by elites. Even the most powerful strategos, like Pericles, had no immunity from attack by ordinary citizens. Accountability was not aspirational, was institutional. This vision of participatory equality among citizens created a political intensity unmatched in most later systems. To be Athenian was not merely to be ruled fairly, it was to rule. Freedom was not privatized, as it is today, into personal choice or consumer preference. It was public, performative, often aggressive. The citizen was not expected to retreat into the safety of private life. In fact, the word idiots, from which our modern word idiot derives, was used to mock those who refused to participate in public affairs. Civic life was not optional. It was the essence of the human. And yet that civic brilliance glowed over a shadowed terrain. Estimates suggest that in classical Athens there were more slaves than citizens. These were not merely household servants, but integral to the machinery of the city's prosperity. Silver in Laurian, toiling in workshops, serving in households, or working in the countryside. Slaves were treated as property. They had no legal rights, no ability to marry formally, no recourse if abused. They could be tortured for testimony in court. The freedom of the citizen was underwritten, day by day, by the unfreedom of the enslaved. This dynamic was not hidden. It was not shameful. It was necessary. The Athenian political system functioned because its citizens had leisure time to debate, legislate, and engage in public life. That leisure was made possible by a workforce stripped of voice and agency. In a bitter irony, the height of human self-rule rested upon the denial of humanity to others. The citizen ruled because others could not. Their very silence enabled his speech, nor were women silent only because of lack of franchise. Athenian women, especially those of citizen families, were expected to remain out of sight, confined largely to the household, where they managed domestic affairs but held no public presence. Marriage was arranged. Adultery by a wife was a crime. Punishable by death, the same act by a husband was tolerated. Women could not own significant property or initiate divorce. They were often legally represented by their male relatives. Athenian drama is filled with powerful, even sympathetic female characters. But these were fantasies spoken by male actors to male audiences, reflections of anxiety more than glimpses of liberation. And yet again, within this brutal architecture, there remained something genuinely radical. When Pericles declared that Athens was a school to all of Greece, he was not boasting idly. The Athenian citizen enjoyed a political dignity that even most modern democracies struggle to reproduce. Unlike representative systems where citizens cast votes every few years, Athenians engaged constantly with the machinery of governance. They practiced democracy not as a ritual but as a habit of life, messy and often irrational, but alive. The institutions of ostracism, for instance, allowed citizens to vote once a year to exile a political figure for a decade, not as punishment for a crime, but to prevent tyranny or restore balance. This power of judgment belonged to no elite council. It resided in the people. It is easy to forget how unique this was in a world dominated by kings, emperors, and divine rulers. Athens did not claim its leader was descended from gods. It subjected him to scrutiny. This orientation challenged long-standing assumptions about authority and obedience. It implied that power was not sacred, but human and, therefore, accountable. Still, the instability of this model was ever present. The democracy was vulnerable to manipulation, demagoguery, and factionalism. It collapsed during the Peloponnesian War, replaced by oligarchy and tyranny, only to be later restored with blood and effort. It relied on a delicate balance of virtue, participation, and luck. Without sustained civic engagement, it decayed, and its violence, both internal and external, could be spectacular. The Democratic Assembly authorized the execution of Socrates, the imperial conquest of Melos, and the disastrous Sicilian expeditional decisions made not by tyrants, but by the people themselves. This raises a further complication. What kind of freedom permits one to vote for atrocity? If liberty is defined purely as agency, then Athens was unmatched. But if freedom also includes wisdom, restraint, or justice, then its failures become harder to ignore. The Athenian citizen was free to speak, but also free to condemn, free to rule, but also free to dominate. The tools of liberty could be used to build or to destroy. They were agnostic. This moral ambiguity lies at the core of the Athenian model. It offered maximal participation, but not necessarily moral outcomes. Even among citizens, equality was not absolute. The wealthiest citizens were expected to fund public works and religious festivals, a practice known as liturgia, but they wielded enormous influence behind the scenes. Political clubs hetairai schemed to shape elections, and the poor remained vulnerable to persuasion by charismatic orators. Education was not universally accessible. While every citizen had the right to speak, not every voice carried equal weight. Yet despite these fissures, the democratic experiment planted a seed that would outlive its architects. Later thinkers, from Roman republicans to Enlightenment philosophers, would look back on Athens as the cradle of civic virtue, but most did so through selective memory. They celebrated the debates, the architecture, the drama, but ignored the slaves, the women, the empire built on tribute. Even today, when modern nations invoke democracy, they rarely mean what the Athenians practiced. Theirs was not government, by delegation, but by presence, not by laws handed down, but by decisions made face to face. In this, Athens poses a challenge, not only to ancient tyrants, but to modern assumptions. Is democracy still democracy when participation is passive, symbolic, or occasional? Are we freer because we are all technically included, even if most are politically inert? The Athenians feared political apathy more than political chaos. Better a volatile assembly than a silent populace. They believed that liberty required exposure, that to be free meant to be vulnerable, answerable, seen. And this may be the final twist in the Athenian illusion, that even its failures were public, its crimes were debated, its flaws paraded, its enemies judged in daylight. There was no curtain of secrecy, no elite managerial class operating in the dark. Power in Athens was naked, and therefore, to some degree, containable. The citizens who condemned Socrates did so openly, and their decision haunted them. The generals who lost battles were tried in full view. There were no scapegoats hidden in the machinery, only people, flawed and loud, doing their best or their worst together. That, in itself, was a kind of freedom. Not freedom from error, but freedom to err openly. To be held accountable not by abstract systems, but by one's fellow citizens. It was brutal, but it was honest. The modern state often protects us from this discomfort by cloaking decisions in procedure, distance, and abstraction. Athens made everything personal, and so, as we leave behind the marble colonnades and blood-stained agora, we must carry the contradictions of Athenian liberty with us. It was real, and it was partial. It was inspiring, and it was cruel. It offered a vision of what humans could do together, and a warning of what they might ignore in doing so. Democracy in Athens was not a finish line, but a flare in the dark brief, flickering, and still visible across centuries. The Athenian model, with its volatile purity, could not survive the scale and pressures of an expanding world. Direct democracy withered in the face of empire. As new lands and populations were drawn into political orbit, governance required something less intimate but more durable. In the Roman Republic, and later the Empire, this durability took form in the idea of citizenship not as a practice of constant public participation, but as a legal identity conferred, extended, and institutionalized across an astonishing diversity of peoples. It was this Roman invention, or rather reinvention, that would define the ancient notion of freedom for centuries to come. Citizenship not as an act, but as a status protective, empowering, and yet increasingly abstract. It promised inclusion, but demanded obedience, offered rights, but claimed bodies, extended privilege while draining agency. It was both a shield and a leash. The Roman Republic did not begin as an egalitarian project. Its early citizens were split between the patricians' aristocratic families with ancestral power and the plebeians, the commoners who fought for generations to win recognition, land rights, and political representation. Through a long and often painful process, the plebeians secured critical victories: the creation of the tribunates, the publication of the 12 tables, and the right to hold office. These reforms created a rough and evolving balance in which Roman liberty was conceived not in terms of abstract autonomy, but as libertas, the freedom to be protected from arbitrary domination, especially by magistrates or aristocrats. This concept was legally defined, embodied in offices, and defended through institutions like the Senate and the assemblies. A Roman citizen could not be scourged without trial, could appeal a magistrate's decision, could own property, vote in elections, sue in court, and pass wealth to heirs. The toga, worn only by citizens, became not just a garment but a uniform of legal sanctity. Citizenship was the lifeblood of the Roman political imagination. To be a citizen was to have standing, and that standing could not be taken lightly. But as the Republic grew, devouring territories and peoples, the boundaries of citizenship became both a weapon and a reward. Rome expanded not only through conquest, but by integrating the conquered first Italian allies, later provincial elites. With each wave of expansion, citizenship was offered as a ladder: fight for Rome, serve the state, and earn legal inclusion. This created a flexible imperial system, where loyalty was incentivized with rights and identity rather than merely imposed by force. By the time of the Social War in the early 1st century BCE, even Rome's Italian allies demanded full citizenship, not out of rebellion, but because the benefits were too valuable to ignore. Still, the transformation was profound. Citizenship became portable, detached from the city itself. One could be a Roman in Spain, Syria, or Gaul without ever setting foot in the capital. This was not civic engagement in the Athenian sense. It was belonging by decree, standardized by law, and enforced by legions. The earlier vision of freedom as political speech gave way to a freedom defined by legal status and imperial protection. Under the empire, especially after Augustus, this trend deepened. The Republic's participatory mechanisms were preserved in name but hollowed in function. The Senate remained, elections were held, but power rested in the emperor's hands. Citizenship, meanwhile, continued to spread. By 212 CE, with the Constitution Antoniniana, Emperor Caracalla granted citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire. What had once been a mark of earned privilege now became universal, at least for those not enslaved. But this universality carried with it a new ambiguity. If everyone is a citizen, then what does citizenship mean? It no longer signified voice in governance, it meant legal personhood under imperial rule, taxable identity, and subjecthood cloaked in the language of equality. This shift toward legal universality also marked a turning point in the experience of freedom itself. Roman citizenship granted protection, but it also required visibility. To be known to the state, one had to be documented. Taxes were levied not by barter but through census. Names, property, dependents, and obligations were recorded and scrutinized. Freedmen, former slaves, who had earned or been granted their liberty, could become citizens. But their obligations did not end with manumission. They were still tied to their former masters through patronage and expected to demonstrate loyalty to the emperor through public displays of support and imperial cult worship. Freedom was codified, but also surveilled. The militarization of Roman life further complicated the meaning of liberty. Service in the legions was one of the most common paths to citizenship for provincials, but the cost was steep: decades of discipline, brutal campaigns, and life far from home. Roman veterans were often granted land or monetary rewards upon retirement, yet they were also instrumentalized to pacify newly conquered territories. Their freedom had been bought with blood and used to ensure the unfreedom of others. The citizen soldier was both a beneficiary and an enforcer of empire. Even more insidious was the role of spectacle in managing freedom. The Roman state perfected a form of social control through entertainment that distracted and absorbed the citizenry, while reaffirming imperial power. The gladiatorial games, chariot races, and public executions served as both a release valve and a mirror. The Colosseum did not merely stage violence, it staged order. The crowd, though immense, was carefully seated by class. Senators sat closest, women in the back, citizens in between. Every cry of delight or horror reinforced the hierarchy. Bread was distributed, games were funded by the emperor or elites, and loyalty was purchased not only with grain but with spectacle. The Roman citizen was not silenced, but he was anesthetized. Even those at the top of the social pyramid were not immune. The Senate became increasingly ceremonial. Emperors like Tiberius and Domitian monitored dissent with paranoia. Under Nero, accusations of treason became theater, with philosophers exiled or ordered to commit suicide. The very freedoms that once distinguished the Republic, debate, oratory, dissent, were now acts of defiance. One could still speak, but only if one wished to gamble with exile or death. The legal protections of citizenship still existed, but they had become fragile, dependent not on law alone but on imperial favor. The emperor was now the interpreter of freedom, and his moods could erase or restore it. Meanwhile, the institution of slavery continued to metastasize. Millions of people, captives of war, children born into bondage, or victims of debt, lived and died as property. Slaves were used for everything: agricultural labor, domestic service, education, entertainment, sex, and administration. Some were literate, even influential, especially in imperial households. Others were chained in mines, doomed to die unseen. Manumission offered the hope of freedom, but only by passing through a system that had first stripped away every previous right. Citizenship could be granted to freedmen, but often conditionally, and always accompanied by social stigma. Despite this, Rome's ideological machinery portrayed itself as a civilization of order and law, where the citizen was protected and dignified. The contradiction was masked by grandeur, by marble, ritual, triumphs, and titles. Even the enslaved were expected to internalize Roman values. The philosopher Epictetus, himself a former slave, taught that true freedom was inner freedom, the ability to accept one's fate and govern oneself regardless of external bondage. It was a doctrine born of necessity, but one that reveals how the Roman world quietly shifted the meaning of liberty away from the political and into the stoic, spiritual, or symbolic. That turn inward, however, was not merely philosophical. It reflected a growing awareness that formal rights were not enough, that legal identity without true power could become its own kind of prison. A Roman citizen who had never served in office, never owned land, never addressed the Senate, was technically free, but was he meaningfully so? If his speech was confined to gossip, his work dictated by survival, and his identity bound by ritual allegiance to emperors and gods he did not choose, was he not also trapped, though by subtler chains? In this context, Roman citizenship becomes a mirror for modern contradictions. It shows how rights can expand while freedom shrinks, how protection can coexist with performance, how the trappings of liberty, paperwork, uniforms, public pageantry can conceal lives increasingly managed by distant authorities. The Roman citizen had more protections than a tribal forager, more prestige than a Sumerian farmer, more opportunities than a Spartan soldier. and yet he may have had less capacity to shape his destiny, less ability to walk away, less room to imagine a life outside the imperial grid. The Roman world, in its fullness, teaches that freedom can be layered, legal, but not existential, public, but not personal. One can be safe but not sovereign, honored but not heard. The citizen may carry documents of dignity, yet live in fear of both mobs and magistrates, of taxes and conscription, of surveillance and silence. The laws may be just, but the soul may still be caged, and yet Rome also reminds us that people adapt, resist, reimagine. Underground Christian sects defied imperial cults. Philosophers withdrew from politics to cultivate inner peace. Gladiators rebelled. Freedmen rose in wealth. Soldiers built new lives in foreign lands. Even within the empire's vast machinery, sparks of agency flickered. The idea of Roman citizenship may have become bloated, bureaucratized, and co-opted, remained, for many, a thing worth claiming. It offered a script to perform, a badge to hold, a shield to invoke when all else failed. The legacy is tangled. Rome gave us roads, laws, and the architecture of power that continues to shape our own empires, visible and invisible. But it also offered a cautionary tale that a citizen is not always free, that rights are not always lived, that the expansion of identity may come with the contraction of autonomy. Rome taught us how to scale civilization, and how easily freedom can vanish within it. If Roman citizenship offered protections wrapped in chains, then the condition of those outside that status, particularly the enslaved, demands a deeper reckoning. For while the citizen's freedom was negotiated and mediated through law, the enslaved were situated at the edge of legal personhood or entirely outside it. Yet even within these brutal hierarchies, movement was not always impossible. The world of antiquity, while soaked in domination, left strange corridors open, narrow, dangerous, and inconsistent, through which some could rise. In the study of ancient slavery and social mobility, the boundaries blur between power and powerlessness, and it becomes harder to ignore the echoes that reach into modern economies, where formal freedom often masks structural captivity. Ancient slavery was not monolithic. In Rome, slavery was deeply embedded in law, ritual, and economy, but it could also be impermanent. Enslaved individuals came from a variety of sources, captured in war, sold by parents, born into bondage, or condemned by courts. Their tasks ranged from the grim and invisible working mines or quarries, cleaning latrines, hauling water, to the intimate and skilled teaching children, accounting finances, even managing estates. Slavery in Rome was not confined to skin color or ethnicity, but determined overwhelmingly by circumstance, defeat, and luck. One could be Greek or Gallic, African or Thracian, and still find oneself yoked to a Roman master. What complicates the modern mind's reckoning with ancient slavery is that it existed within a fluid legal framework that allowed for manumission not as a fantasy, but as a frequent, if not always voluntary, reality. In fact, Rome manumitted its slaves at rates unmatched by later systems, such as the Atlantic slave trade. Legal routes to freedom included purchase with savings, or peculium, sometimes allowed by the master, reward for loyalty, or as part of the master's will. Some masters freed their slaves as an act of piety, others for pragmatic reasons. Slaves could continue to serve, now as clients, with gratitude and obligation. But manumission did not dissolve hierarchy. A freedman libertus was not a full citizen in all respects. He owed loyalty to his former master, now his patronus, and could not hold major office. His children, however, would be born as full citizens. Thus, freedom was cumulative across generations, ladder built on submission. Many liberti engaged in trade, banking, or administration, rising to wealth and influence. Some even constructed elaborate tombs to commemorate their transformation, their very existence, a rebuttal to the idea that bondage was destiny. Still, these success stories were exceptions. The majority of freed slaves lived modestly, often precariously, their social mobility real but bounded, and always, at every turn, there were limits. The freedom granted to a manumitted slave was never quite equal. They could be insulted in ways that citizens could sue for. They could be whipped, though rarely. Their past was never fully erased. Even in death, tomb inscriptions often identified the freed status of the deceased, as if liberation required constant footnoting. This form of constrained mobility freedom granted on condition, with strings attached, bears uncomfortable resemblance to certain modern systems, where mobility exists in theory but is hemmed in by debts, documentation, and inherited disadvantage. If Rome reveals one model of mobility through legal inclusion, the Islamic caliphates offer another, rooted not just in law but in strategic integration. In the Abbasid and Umayyad periods, slavery was widespread but functioned under Islamic legal frameworks that emphasized manumission as a moral good. The Quran repeatedly encourages the freeing of slaves as a virtuous act, particularly as expiation for sin. Islamic jurists codified pathways for slaves to gain freedom through contracts mukataba, where they could buy themselves out over time. The difference here lies not only in the mechanisms, but in the social philosophy that framed them, not always honored in practice, but present in principle. Even more striking was the mobility available to certain classes of military slaves, most notably the Mamluks. These were typically boys taken from the Caucasus, Central Asia, or Eastern Europe, converted to Islam, trained rigorously in martial and administrative skills, and deployed across the Islamic world. While they began as property of the state, or elite patrons, many rose to prominence. The Mamluks of Egypt, in fact, eventually seized political control and established their own sultanate, ruling as a military caste for centuries. This inversion, where those once enslaved became rulers, was extraordinary. Their legitimacy was not derived from bloodline, but from performance and loyalty, echoing meritocratic ideals filtered through deeply coercive roots. Yet even within this exceptional upward path, freedom was fragile and conditioned. The Mamluks, though powerful, were barred from passing their status hereditarily. Their sons were not automatically part of the Mamluk class. Each generation had to be recruited, trained, and reinserted into the same machine. In this way, the state ensured the cycle of dependency continued. It was social mobility without stability advancement, decoupled from generational continuity. Like modern contract workers or foreign laborers, Mamluks could rise but not settle. They were simultaneously indispensable and replaceable. It is here, in these shadowy zones between servitude and citizenship, that ancient slavery forces a confrontation with modernity. For all the brutality of ancient systems, they were at least honest in their cruelty. Slavery was visible, naked, and codified. Today, we are taught to recoil from it, and rightly so. Yet in the structures of wage labor, particularly at the global periphery, a subtler system has emerged. Workers labor in garment factories for pennies, unable to unionize, living in dormitories owned by their employer, controlled not by shackles, but by necessity. Migrants in the Gulf states surrender passports to sponsors, unable to leave or change jobs without permission. Students graduate into debt peonage, their first decades of adult life scripted by repayment schedules and credit. Ratings. These are not slaves, technically, but neither are they free in any robust sense. What separates the ancient slave from the modern laborer is not always autonomy, but recognition. The ancient slave was owned, yes, but also known. Their status was explicit. The Roman master was responsible for the body of the slave. Abuse could be punished, at least in principle. The Islamic law required humane treatment, and manumission was publicly encouraged. The modern laborer, by contrast, is outsourced, subcontracted, anonymized. Their suffering is not denied but dispersed across supply chains, legal jurisdictions, and public indifference. Even resistance in antiquity took forms that bear comparison to today's struggles. The slave rebellions led by Spartacus, while ultimately crushed, revealed a powerful undercurrent of collective agency. These were not isolated acts of desperation, they were coordinated military campaigns, challenging not just individual masters but the Roman order itself. Elsewhere, enslaved people sabotaged tools, fled plantations, or subverted household roles. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, records show fugitives hunted down, punished, returned. Yet the frequency of these chases implies how common flight and defiance were. Slavery was never passively accepted, was negotiated, resisted, reshaped from below. In the Islamic world, too, slaves found avenues for expression and influence. The Zanj rebellion in 9th century Iraq, led by enslaved East Africans in the salt marshes, grew into a full-scale revolt that lasted over a decade. It carved out territory, built fortifications, and demanded political negotiation before being brutally suppressed. These uprisings reveal that, even in the most constrained circumstances, human beings clawed for dignity. Their bodies were controlled, but their wills remained active. They left traces hidden in court records, inscriptions, ruins not just as victims, but as actors, and always, alongside violence, there was cultural presence. Enslaved people transmitted languages, cooked food, sang songs, told stories. In households, they raised children. In markets, they shaped tastes. In courts, they whispered into the ears of princes. The enslaved were not simply labor, they were cultural agents, nodes of transmission across empires. Many of the philosophical texts, medical treatises, and poetic forms we inherit today passed through the hands of people who had no formal freedom. Their intelligence and labor were appropriated, but their influence remained. To compare this with modern structures is not to suggest equivalence, but to raise hard questions. When does economic dependency become captivity? At what point does choice evaporate under the weight of necessity? If an employee cannot afford to quit, is he free? If a migrant must accept abuse or deportation, is she autonomous? We congratulate ourselves for abolishing legal slavery, and indeed, it is one of civilization's true milestones. But we have not abolished the hunger that once made slavery profitable, the demand for cheap, compliant labor. And so, the ancient world, with all its cruelty, offers not only horror, but reflection. It forces us to see that social mobility and bondage have always coexisted, often within the same system. That one man's advancement often depends on another's silence. That freedom, when measured solely by legality, misses the deeper truths of power, It also reveals that dignity cannot be entirely denied. Even in the worst conditions, people dreamed, plotted, and preserved meaning. Whether through manumission, rebellion, or ritual, they carved out space, however narrow, to assert their personhood. The freedman who commissioned his own tomb, the Mamluk who ruled a sultanate, the Zanj who built a fortress, all left behind evidence not just of what was done to them, but what they did in return. Freedom, as it took root in the ancient world, never grew evenly across its landscape. And nowhere was this more evident than in the lives of women. While male autonomy found political expression in assemblies, courts, and battlefields, female autonomy moved in subtler channels, often confined to the private realm, shaped by laws written in other hands. And yet, beneath the surface of patriarchal empires and religious codes, there existed a complex spectrum of constraints and liberties, some surprising, some suffocating. Comparing the lives of women across cultures reveals not a flat history of subjugation, but a jagged terrain where legal rights, economic control, and social presence varied dramatically and sometimes with more nuance than modern assumptions allow. In classical Athens, the democratic triumphs of the polis were built upon exclusions so deep that they formed the bedrock of daily life. Athenian women, particularly those of the citizen class, were expected to inhabit a world of interiorities, chaste and withdrawn. Their role was to preserve the oikos, the household, through marriage, childbearing, and the weaving of both fabric and lineage. Respectable women rarely appeared in public, and when they did, it was often veiled or accompanied. They had no legal personhood independent of their male guardian, Kyrios, could not own substantial property, and were excluded from political life entirely. Their sexuality was regulated, their movements constrained, and their opinions largely absent from surviving public discourse. But even within this architecture of erasure, their agency persisted, expressed not through speech in the forum, but through influence in kinship networks, ritual authority in certain religious cults, and the management of domestic economies. Women presided over household slaves, arranged marriages for their children, and participated in festivals such as the Thesmophoria, dedicated to Demeter, which men could not attend. Their silence was a cultural ideal, but not always a lived reality. Tragedy and comedy alike, performed by men for male audiences, still gave voice to female figures, both defiant and cunning Medea, Antigone Lysistrata, reflecting male anxieties, but also the acknowledgement that control could never be total. Sparta, by contrast, offers a striking counterpoint. While it remains one of the most militarized and hierarchical societies of antiquity, Spartan women enjoyed an unusual degree of economic and social power. This was not due to feminist foresight, but demographic and institutional necessity. With men constantly training or at war, Spartan women became stewards of the household economy. They owned land by some estimates, controlling nearly 40% of Sparta's arable property by the 4th century BCE. They could inherit wealth and manage estates, and while they still married young and were expected to bear children for the state, they were not cloistered or voiceless. Spartan girls were educated, exercised publicly, and trained for physical robustness. Their presence in public spaces was normalized, their assertiveness tolerated, even praised. The contrast was so stark that other Greek writers, such as Aristotle, viewed Spartan women as unruly and indulgent, but their strength was real and institutional. They mocked cowards, owned slaves, and formed the cultural backbone of a society that prized martial excellence above all else. Their freedom was not political, but it was economic and social, a kind of liberty defined by absence. The absence of men, of urban life, and of external trade, which turned internal management into authority. Roman women, especially in the late Republic and Empire, occupied a space somewhere between the Athenian shadow and Spartan confidence. Legally, they remained under male guardianship, first their fathers, then their husbands, but these restrictions became increasingly porous. Elite women, particularly the matrone, wielded significant informal power. They managed households that functioned as miniature economies, supervised slaves and freedmen, and controlled dowries that could rival small treasuries. Some maneuvered around guardianship laws through legal fictions, gaining control over their finances and property in the imperial period. Women like Livia, Agrippina, and Julia Domna played central roles in court politics, diplomacy, and even ideology. They sponsored public works, corresponded with philosophers, and appeared on coinage, subtle declarations of influence wrapped in acceptable feminine imagery. The law of the Jus Trium Liberorum, which rewarded freeborn women who bore 3 or more children with legal privileges such as freedom from guardianship, created incentives for women to gain independence via motherhood. This law, though unevenly enforced, reflected an evolving Roman awareness of female contribution, not just biologically, but structurally. Still, the division between private and public life persisted, and most Roman women, especially those of the lower classes, found themselves tethered to labor, domestic service, or precarious forms of urban trade. While elite women debated philosophy or administered estates, plebeian women sold goods in markets, nursed children not their own, or worked in taverns and bathhouses. The imperial machine required both visibility and invisibility, and women moved through it depending on their class, their ethnicity, and their proximity to male protection. In the early Islamic world, particularly under the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates, a different model of autonomy emerged, one structured not by citizenship or birth, but by contract and religious law. Women in Islamic jurisprudence were granted rights that startled European observers centuries later: the right to own and inherit property, initiate divorce, receive a bridegift mahr as personal wealth, and testify in court. The Quran codified these protections not abstractly, but with precision. Marriage was a legal contract, and while patriarchy remained deeply embedded, it was offset by formal mechanisms that recognized a woman's legal and financial personhood. These rights varied widely in practice, of course. Cultural traditions, regional norms, and class status shaped their application. But the theoretical framework allowed room for assertiveness. Women such as Aisha, wife of the Prophet Muhammad, participated in political disputes, transmitted hadith, and lead armies. In Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, women patronized scholars, funded endowments, and attended public lectures behind veils or screens. The veil itself, contrary to later politicized readings, was not merely a symbol of oppression, but a form of demarcated space, sometimes protective, sometimes limiting, but always contextual. This fluidity was not unique to Islam. Across medieval Christendom, convents offered another kind of autonomy, an enclosed one. In an age where marriage was often transactional, the convent became a place of refuge, learning, and spiritual authority. Noble families sent daughters to nunneries, not only for piety but to safeguard property, resolve inheritance disputes, or prevent politically undesirable unions. Within the convent, women could read, write, and in some cases govern. Abbesses, such as Hildegard of Bingen, wrote theology, advised kings, and composed music. The rules of monastic life, though strict, provided a coherent alternative to the perils of childbirth, the politics of marriage, and the limitations of secular domesticity, and yet the convent, too, was a paradox. It liberated by withdrawing. It offered voice by sealing the door. Many women entered by force, not choice. Vows could be lifelong, and violation was punished severely. The habit could be sanctuary or cage, as with veils, silence, and seclusion were double-edged. They preserved dignity in one context, but imposed erasure in another. The same mechanisms that shielded could also isolate. Autonomy was never free-floating, it always had a cost. When modern feminist discourse emerged in the Enlightenment and accelerated during the 19th and 20th centuries, it drew inspiration from many sources, but often flattened the past into caricature. Ancient women became victims, Islamic culture oppressive, medieval Europe benighted. Progress was measured by legal milestones, suffrage, property rights, education, but these gains often obscured continuing dependencies. A woman may now vote or work or own land, but she is still monitored, judged, shaped by expectations that mutate rather than vanish. Surveillance moves from the Kyrios to the algorithm, from the veil to the gaze of 1,000 digital mirrors, and while rights have expanded, so too has the complexity of subjugation. Modern women may be legally protected, but face structural inequality in wages, representation, healthcare, and domestic labor. Choice itself has been commodified. A woman's decision to mother, to marry, to dress a certain way is now often framed not as moral or communal, but as personal branding. The ancient household has been replaced by the workplace, but not always with more justice. The language has changed, but not always the dynamics. Even gains are uneven. In some global contexts, women have entered professional life in unprecedented numbers, shaped legislation, led nations. In others, they remain bound by older codes, now reinforced by newer tools, state surveillance, religious extremism, economic desperation. In Afghanistan, the loss of educational rights is not merely a policy shift, but the closure of possibility. In Iran, the veil is not only cloth, but a battleground. In the US, debates over reproductive rights reflect deeper anxieties about autonomy, control, and the definition of womanhood itself. The ancient world, then, does not simply sit behind us like a closed book. It continues to echo through laws, through metaphors, through comparisons that illuminate and unsettle. The Spartan woman who owned estates, the Roman matron who wrote wills, the Abbasid jurist who ruled on female contracts. These are not anomalies, but reminders that freedom is always partial, always negotiated. There is no pure past, no unbroken arc of progress. There are only struggles, victories, erasures, and returns. And so we look back not to judge, but to understand that autonomy is not a destination, but a process, that dignity is never given, but fought for, and that the forms of subjugation most effective are often the ones disguised as protection. What begins in laws and bodies, in chains and domestic walls, eventually seeks refuge elsewhere. As empires grew and as social hierarchies a quiet revolution began, one that unfolded not in streets or courts, but in the recesses of the human mind. Across the ancient world, a variety of spiritual and philosophical traditions emerged. each grappling with a deepening paradox that one could be externally constrained yet internally sovereign. These systems, Stoicism in Rome and Greece, Buddhism in India and Asia, Christianity in its early ascetic form, even strands of Hindu and Taoist thought began to teach that liberty could survive in a cell, that dignity could persist without status, and that the soul's posture toward suffering mattered more than the suffering itself. This shift did not emerge from luxury or complacency, it was often born from crisis. As the Roman Empire centralized power and hollowed its republican core, Stoicism rose in response. Originally developed by Zeno of Citium in the early 3rd century BCE and refined by thinkers like Epictetus, Seneca, and later Marcus Aurelius, Stoicism rejected the fragile promises of external power. Fortune, they taught, was unreliable. Health, status, property, these lay beyond our control. True freedom came only from mastering one's reactions, aligning desire with nature, and distinguishing what is within us from what is not. Epictetus, a former slave, taught that freedom was not the ability to act without restraint, but the ability to choose one's attitude regardless of circumstance. He famously said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." His own life embodied this idea. Born into slavery, crippled by a brutal master, and eventually freed, he never attained high political office or wealth, yet he shaped the ethical imagination of an empire. His discourses insist that even the enslaved may be freer than emperors if they are indifferent to what the world can take from them. It is a hard doctrine, unsentimental, stoic in every sense, but its appeal lies in its resilience. When institutions fail, when injustice is systematized, Stoicism teaches endurance without bitterness, focus without illusion. The Roman elite adopted it selectively. Seneca, advisor to Nero, composed serene meditations on virtue while benefiting from immense privilege. He praised poverty while living in comfort. But his contradictions also reveal a tension inherent in Stoicism itself. Can one truly be free? While serving power, can detachment coexist with complicity? Seneca's writings plead for balance, but the very fact that Stoicism was popular among those navigating tyranny suggests its usefulness as a survival strategy. It did not require the world to change, it required the self to change in how it received the world. Even Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, ruled with severity while urging himself, in his meditations, to be gentle, humble, and unshaken by praise or insult. That these ideals coexisted with persecution and expansionist. War is not just irony, it is a window into the moral gymnastics of power. Even the ruler sought freedom from the throne he could not leave. Meanwhile, far to the east, Buddhism was articulating a different, though curiously aligned, vision. Founded in the 5th or 6th century BCE by Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, this tradition began with a diagnosis: life is suffering, dukkha, and suffering is rooted in attachment. Where Stoicism saw desire as misaligned with nature, Buddhism saw it as the root of bondage itself. The self that clings, fears, and grasps is the self that suffers. Liberation, nirvana, comes not through control, but through release. One ceases to be a prisoner not by breaking down the walls, but by ceasing to believe the walls define the self at all. This model of inner freedom is more radical than Stoicism. In one sense, Sit doesn't just ask for emotional restraint, but for the total undoing of the ego's illusions. There is no soul to master in the Stoic sense, but rather an unfolding consciousness to observe, train, and let go of. through meditation, ethical conduct, and wisdom. The Buddhist practitioner slowly dissolves the mental habits that keep the mind bound: anger, craving, ignorance. The result is not stoic endurance, but serene detachment. In early monastic traditions across India and later Tibet, China, and Southeast Asia, this practice took root as a daily discipline. Monks renounced wealth, family, and power not as rejection, but as freedom. By voluntarily embracing simplicity, they stepped outside the structures that demand endless striving. And yet this renunciation was not escapism, was inquiry. What is the self? What is suffering? And what remains when all false structures fall away? Women, often barred from external power, found in Buddhist and Stoic principles an invitation to reclaim a kind of sovereignty that did not depend on status. In early Buddhist communities, nuns such as Mahapochapati and the poet Bhaddakandalakisa wrote of insight, autonomy, and peace. Their verses, preserved in the Therigatha, describe the shedding of roles, the realization of impermanence, and the arrival at unshakable freedom. These were not passive women, they were intellectual and spiritual actors in a world that gave them few legal rights, yet honored their inner transformation. In the Christian world, a parallel evolution occurred though, filtered through distinct theological lenses. Early Christianity, born in the Roman Empire's shadow, preached submission to God, humility, and love of neighbor. But beneath this meek surface was a radical redefinition of power. "The last shall be first," said Christ. "The kingdom of God is within you." The Christian emphasis on the soul's eternal destiny shifted the axis of freedom inward. One could be imprisoned, beaten, crucified and yet triumph if one's heart remained pure. Martyrs, willingly embracing death, became icons not of victimhood, but of transcendent victory. Paul, writing in chains, declared himself free in Christ. Slaves were urged to obey their masters, but also told that in the eyes of God there is neither slave nor free, male nor female. This paradox, social obedience, coupled with spiritual equality, was both a tool of survival and a source of subversion. In practice, the Church often reinforced hierarchies, yet early Christian communities, especially among the poor, the sick, and the marginalized, fostered mutual aid, dignity, and meaning. Freedom was not political, it was salvific. Monastic life, which flourished in the deserts of Egypt and later across medieval Europe, became the Christian laboratory for internal liberty. Like Buddhist monks, Christian ascetics fled the city to conquer the self. They battled demons not with swords but with silence, fasting, and contemplation. Figures like Saint Anthony, Saint Benedict, and later mystics like Julian of Norwich or Meister Eckhart described a form of freedom that began where desire ended. They were still bound by vows, by obedience to abbots, but in that binding they claimed to find a deeper release. For them, the enemy was not empire, but pride. Not Caesar, but the self's delusion. The convergence of these traditions, Buddhist, Christian, and more, suggests that across ancient civilizations, liberty came to mean more than legal standing. It meant spiritual clarity. It meant disentangling oneself from what cannot be controlled, whether that be fate, suffering, or death. And while the methods varied, rational analysis, meditation, prayer, the end goal, echoed across the continents. Serenity in the face of chaos, clarity amidst illusion, and sovereignty not of the body but of the mind. Even in ancient Hindu texts, such as the Bhagavad Gita, the tension between duty, dharma, and detachment, vairagya, plays out in cosmic terms. Arjuna, the warrior, is told to fight not out of rage or ambition, but because action must be done without attachment to results. True freedom lies not in abandoning the world, but in acting without clinging. It is a philosophy that fuses ethics with transcendence. Fulfill your role, but do not become your role. Serve the world, but do not be trapped by its praise or condemnation. These traditions did not deny the reality of external oppression, but they offered a kind of resistance from within, a refusal to be defined by pain, a claim to dignity no empire could fully strip away. For enslaved persons, prisoners, exiles, and outcasts, this was more than abstraction. It was a lifeline. The Roman slave who studied Epictetus, the Buddhist nun who shed her caste, the Christian martyr who sang in the arena, they each participated in a hidden rebellion. Their chains were real, but not absolute, and yet these philosophies also pose uncomfortable questions for modern ideals. If freedom can exist within bondage, does that make bondage tolerable? If a slave can be freer than a master, does that redefine what it means to be oppressed? Modern political theory, built on autonomy, consent, and rights, often struggles with this tension. We value choice, but the ancients remind us that choice is not the only or even the deepest form of liberty. What happens, then, when our external freedoms expand, but our inner lives remain disordered, anxious, reactive? Contemporary life, saturated with stimulation and distraction, often leaves little space for the kind of inner work these ancient traditions prioritized. Our freedom to speak, move, and consume does not guarantee peace. We are bombarded by demands, overwhelmed by information, tethered to devices that constantly fragment attention. In this context, the wisdom of ancient spiritual paths begins to sound less archaic and more urgent. They do not solve injustice, but they offer tools to survive it, and perhaps to transcend its deepest wounds. If the mind could claim sanctuary from chains, the body rarely escaped the gaze. Ancient life, unlike today's digital solitude, unfolded in the open. To be alive in a Greek polis or a Roman metropolis was to be seen constantly, sometimes violently, sometimes indifferently, but never anonymously. Streets were narrow, homes were porous, and the private realm, such as it existed, was often a luxury of the rich. For the majority, daily survival meant immersion in the crowd, buying bread, drawing water, attending rituals, or navigating the clamor of the forum. And with that crowd came an ancient form of surveillance, not algorithmic or bureaucratic, but communal and intimate, built not on data, but on judgment. Modern surveillance tends to be silent. Cameras do not gasp. Algorithms do not whisper. A facial recognition scan in a metro station leaves no trace on the face it identifies. The watcher is hidden. The watched rarely knows. But in ancient times, surveillance was deeply embodied. The Athenian assembly, for instance, was not simply a space for political speech. It was a theater of exposure. A man's rhetoric was not judged in abstraction. It was dissected by hundreds of eyes, ears, and mouths, all drawn from his own city. His gestures, voice, posture, and pedigree were not just noticed, they were memorized, repeated, mocked, sometimes weaponized. Oratory could elevate, but it could also destroy. To stand and speak in public was to gamble one's reputation before a deeply opinionated collective. And yet, for many Athenian citizens, this risk was part of freedom itself. Their liberty was not conceived as insulation from scrutiny, but as the right to participate in it, to speak, to judge, to vote, and to be voted on. This was democratic exposure, and it came with no shield. In the courts, too, litigants represented themselves, appealing not to distant bureaucrats, but to large juries made up of fellow citizens. Legal argument became performative. Every case was a kind of social theater in which not only the law, but character, history, and loyalty were on trial. Witnesses were questioned publicly, verdicts were delivered immediately, and shame could follow a man for life. This openness did not foster kindness. Athenian comedy thrived on personal insult. Aristophanes, in his plays, ridiculed politicians, philosophers, even gods, by name. Bodies were mocked, accents exaggerated, failings exposed. There was no legal protection from satire. Honor was preserved, if at all, through resilience. In such a world, public life demanded both skin and spirit thickened by custom, for women, who were expected to remain largely unseen. Being dragged into visibility through scandal, litigation, or rumor was doubly destructive. A woman's reputation was not hers alone. It belonged to her father, husband, and sons. Thus, in Athens, privacy for women was paradoxically a form of public control. To keep them hidden was to keep them respectable. Rome, too, was a civilization of exposure, though shaped more by imperial scale and military hierarchy. Public spaces dominated urban life. The forum, the basilica, the market, the baths, the amphitheater. Privacy was rare and often symbolic. In the Roman bath, one stripped not only clothing, but status. Senators and freedmen bathed in the same water, gossiped in the same steam. Surveillance here was mutual, polite, erotic, competitive. A man's body was not private. It was evidence of discipline or indulgence. Scars could signify military valor or criminal punishment. Obesity was read as a sign of decadence, pallor as cowardice. Identity was judged not just by speech or wealth, but by form. Even domestic life was porous. The Roman domus was arranged around the atrium, a semi-public reception space, open to clients, petitioners, or passers-by. The paterfamilias performed his authority not in hiding, but in view. His patronage, generosity, and discipline were constantly observed. Letters were often dictated aloud to slaves, and meals served with an audience. The ideal Roman male was not private, but legible. His strength, restraint, and piety all on display. And women, though more veiled than in earlier republican times, also lived under this communal eye. The matrona was praised for modesty, but even modesty had to be seen to be believed. Virtue, like vice, required witnesses. Shame, in this context, was not an internal feeling. It was a social fact. To be shamed was to be named, watched, and judged, sometimes with exile, sometimes with death. The Roman censor, a magistrate responsible for public morality, could expel senators, strip citizenship, or punish extravagance. His power was based not on force, but on the weight of communal expectation. Religion, too, was less about private belief than public practice. Sacrifices, festivals, and omens unfolded before crowds. Even the gods seemed to require audience. The sacred and the political blurred into a civic gaze where omitting a ritual could spark suspicion, and piety meant participation, not introspection. But what made this ancient surveillance bearable, perhaps even desirable to some, was its reciprocity. The eye of the crowd was not disembodied. You could see who judged you, and judged them in return. This created a web of mutual awareness, in which behavior was regulated not by unseen institutions, but by one's social neighborhood. It was cruel, yes, but intimate. The judgment came with context. The slanderer could be confronted. The gossip knew your brother. And while this did not guarantee fairness, it allowed for negotiation, apology. Revenge. Modern surveillance, by contrast, often lacks this face. It is administrative, statistical, and opaque. We are watched not by neighbors, but by code. A misstep. Online triggers, algorithmic consequences, demonetization, shadow banning, profiling without explanation. Our preferences are tracked, monetized, and fed back to us in curated ads. Behavior is analyzed by patterns, not people. And though we rarely feel this gaze, it is no less persistent. In some ways, it is more penetrating. Ancient shame required an audience. Today, shame can be harvested from meta, tada, social media resurrects some of the communal elements of ancient exposure, but with distortion. Online, reputation is sculpted through avatars, and judgment comes from strangers. There is no shared city, no common rituals. Outrage can be manufactured at scale, context stripped, apology rejected. The old city-state demanded public face and private restraint. The digital city offers private indulgence and public flame. An Athenian orator risked being heckled, but his words vanished with the wind. A tweet remains forever, yet in both worlds, the crowd remains central. What changes is its form and distance. In ancient societies, the crowd was embodied. Its eye was literal, its memory short but vivid. In modernity, the crowd is abstracted, sometimes invisible, sometimes overwhelming, always a step removed. And this detachment makes modern surveillance more difficult to resist. You cannot look into the eye of an algorithm. You cannot plead with a server. In Athens, shame was a punishment. In modern life, it is a product. Still, one cannot idealize. The past ancient surveillance, for all its human scale, could be brutal. Public punishments were theatrical. Flogging, branding, and execution occurred before audiences. Crucifixion was designed to be seen. The purpose was not just deterrence, but spectacle shame as public pedagogy. In Egypt, failed scribes were beaten in front of their peers. In Rome, slaves were crucified en masse after the Spartacus rebellion, lining the Appian Way like human warnings. The eye of the crowd could turn sadistic, and the line between justice and humiliation was thin. Accused adulteresses in Athens might be paraded, heads shaven. Debt could mean enslavement. Children of disgraced men could lose their inheritance. There were no safe spaces. Even the temples were scenes of judgment. In Delphi, visitors sought divine verdicts before crowds of strangers. Pilgrimage, healing, and prayer all unfolded in public. To be ancient was to be watched not occasionally, but as a condition of life. This omnipresence of the gaze shaped identity. People internalized expectations. Masculinity required performance, strength, eloquence, composure. Femininity demanded virtue, modesty, fecundity. Deviance was not private sin, but public scandal. And while some resisted philosophers, mystics, rebels most adapted, the reward for conformity was honor. The price of failure, often irreparable shame. Yet one must ask, was this worse than today's silent observation? Is it better to be watched by neighbors who judge in person or by systems that cannot be questioned? Is the shame that ends a political career in Rome more or less oppressive than the quiet exclusion created by a flagged credit score or a denied job interview based on unseen analytics? Freedom, in this light, becomes hard to define. The ancients lacked privacy but knew their judges. We have privacy in form, but not in fact. We speak more, but are heard less. We display more, but connect less deeply. Their world was small, but responsive. Ours is vast, but indifferent. And perhaps that indifference is the new shame, not loud, not theatrical, but the sense that one's actions are monitored, recorded, and interpreted without care or recourse. Still, even within these systems, there are forms of agency. Just as ancient citizens navigated the gaze through wit, ritual, and resilience, modern individuals develop strategies, encryption, anonymity, irony, withdrawal. The tools change, but the need to protect the self from the crowd's distortions remains. And so, the question persists, not whether we are watched, but how we respond. Do we reshape ourselves to appease the eye, or do we cultivate a space the eye cannot reach? Do we accept exposure as the price of participation, or do we retreat? The ancient city demanded courage of presence. Perhaps we must demand the same courage, not only to be seen, but to remain human when being seen becomes its own kind of trap. Beyond the structured walls of cities and the sprawling complexities of empire, a different model of freedom unfolded, one defined not by law codes or citizenship, but by mobility, kinship, and resistance to centralized authority. Nomadic and stateless peoples, often labeled as barbarians by their sedentary neighbors, inhabited vast landscapes where hierarchies were less rigid, social bonds more personal, and autonomy a daily necessity rather than a legal abstraction. From the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Arabia and the forests of Northern Europe, these societies challenged the assumptions of civilization and freedom alike. They remind us that liberty is not solely the product of state structures, but can thrive in horizontal networks and fluid alliances. The Scythians, fierce horsemen of the Eurasian steppe, epitomize this alternative freedom, flourishing between the 9th century BCE and the 4th century CE. Their culture defied the urbanism of Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. Instead of cities and bureaucracies, they built mobile camps, followed grazing lands, and formed kinship clans governed by consensus among elders and warriors. Their social order was neither deeply stratified nor centralized. Leadership was often temporary, tied to charisma and military success rather than inherited authority. A chieftain could rise and fall within seasons, and power was constantly contested. This political fluidity bred a unique form of individual liberty. A Scythian warrior, mounted and armed, could exert influence through prowess and loyalty rather than pedigree. Women, too, played notable roles. Some fought alongside men, and archaeological finds of weapons in female graves suggest a social recognition of their capabilities. Their freedom was precarious, dependent on the land and the herd, but it was tangible and immediate. In Greek and Persian accounts, the Scythians were often portrayed as savage and chaotic, a reflection more of cultural bias than accurate understanding. Yet their social structure resisted assimilation by imperial powers for centuries. When confronted by Cyrus the Great and later Alexander the Great, their mobility and decentralized authority made conquest difficult. Their freedom was a form of sovereignty that the fixed bureaucracies of empire could not easily dismantle. Similarly, the Mongols in the 13th century projected a new form of nomadic power, one that temporarily united vast territories without sacrificing core freedoms. Before the rise of Genghis Khan, Mongol society was fragmented into tribes and clans, each led by councils and informal elders. Loyalty was personal, and allegiance could shift. The harshness of steppe life bred resilience and a fierce sense of autonomy. Children were taught horsemanship and hunting. Women managed herds and households, often wielding substantial authority. When Genghis Khan forged the Mongol Empire, he did not abolish nomadic freedom but restructured it. Laws known as the Yasa regulated behavior but also protected meritocracy and religious tolerance. The Mongols prized mobility and decentralized command, enabling swift conquests that astonished sedentary civilizations. Paradoxically, this vast empire did not impose rigid bureaucracy initially, but relied on networks of tribute and personal loyalty. The Mongol model combined expansive political control with persistent nomadic freedoms. Warriors retained personal property, could switch allegiance, and participated in decision-making. Women in Mongol society, unlike many contemporary cultures, enjoyed relative freedoms, managing herds, participating in trade, and in some cases influencing leadership decisions. This blend of empire and freedom challenges the notion that political expansion must mean the loss of autonomy to the west and north. Germanic tribes, such as the Goths, Vandals, and Saxons, displayed similarly horizontal social systems before their absorption into the Roman world. Their assemblies things served as forums for free men to debate, enact laws, and resolve disputes. Kingship was often elective and limited by councils. Individual honor, kin, loyalty, and personal courage were the currencies of power. These tribal laws and customs codified freedoms unfamiliar to the imperial bureaucracies. A free man could bear arms, participate in assemblies, and hold land communally or individually with the right to be judged by peers. While their societies could be warlike and competitive, they lacked the rigid stratification of city-states and empires. Their mobility, whether seasonal migration or warfare, preserved their independence from distant rulers. The Bedouins of the Arabian deserts embody yet another variant of stateless freedom. For millennia, their survival depended on fluid clan structures, oral law, and an ethic of hospitality and honor. Their social fabric emphasized autonomy within the tribe and strong mutual obligations. Authority was decentralized and negotiated, resting on elders and poets rather than kings or governors. The harsh desert environment made large centralized states difficult to sustain. Instead, the Bedouins perfected a lifestyle of resilience, moving with seasons, protecting water sources, and balancing conflict with alliance. Women in Bedouin society played important roles in maintaining family networks, managing households, and sometimes participating in tribal negotiations. Their freedoms were not codified in written laws, but lived in daily practice. With the rise of Islam in the 7th century, many Bedouin tribes integrated into the expanding polity while preserving aspects of their horizontal autonomy. The early caliphates depended on tribal alliances, and nomadic freedom was accommodated rather than crushed. Yet as states grew stronger, tensions arose between centralized authority and nomadic independence, a tension that has echoed throughout history. Across these diverse nomadic societies, certain patterns emerge. First, the absence of formal state apparatus did not imply lawlessness. Instead, social norms, customs, and oral traditions created accountability and cohesion. Justice was administered in assemblies, and violations of honor could lead to exile or feud. Second, mobility was not just physical but political. Movement allowed escape from domination and facilitated fluid alliances. This made centralized control difficult, preserving individual and collective autonomy. Third, kinship and personal loyalty underpinned governance. Authority was relational, earned, and contingent rather than fixed or hereditary. This ensured leaders remained accountable to their followers. Fourth, gender roles, while variable, often allowed for greater female participation in social and economic life than sedentary states. The demands of nomadic survival required contributions from all members, blurring strict patriarchal controls. These societies provide a striking counterpoint to the urban, bureaucratic models of freedom examined earlier. They suggest that liberty need not be tethered to citizenship, law codes, or property. It can arise from personal bonds, movement, and the ability to opt out of centralized power. This freedom, however, was fragile and often precarious, dependent on ecological factors, military strength, and the goodwill of neighbors. The modern state, with its emphasis on borders, surveillance, and regulation, has systematically diminished these forms of freedom. Nomadic peoples have been settled forcibly, tribal assemblies replaced by centralized courts, and mobility curtailed by passports and policing. The transition from statelessness to statehood often meant the loss of personal autonomy, replaced by legal identities and bureaucratic categories. Yet the legacy of the free barbarian remains vital. It challenges assumptions about civilization and freedom, reminding us that authority can be decentralized, power fluid, and liberty embodied in everyday movement and kinship. It raises the question, is freedom the ability to vote or the ability to choose where to walk? Is it the security of a city or the openness of the steppe? These questions resonate today in debates over indigenous rights, border politics, and the meaning of sovereignty. They invite us to rethink freedom not as a product of state design, but as a lived condition, one that can flourish in the cracks of empire, in the sway of horses, and in the whispered counsels of clans. The question of freedom has often been framed in terms of political rights or bodily autonomy, but perhaps no comparison sharpens the paradoxes of liberty better than the economic conditions of medieval serfs and modern wage laborers. To many, the serf of the Middle Ages appears the very antithesis of freedom, tethered to land, bound to obligations, stripped of choice. By contrast, today's workers are ostensibly free to sell their labor, change jobs, and navigate a market economy. Yet beneath this surface lies a complex reality where debt, insecurity, and technological oversight curtail autonomy in ways often more insidious than medieval bonds. Serfdom, the dominant form of rural labor in Europe, roughly from the 9th to the 15th centuries, tied millions to a system that was neither slavery nor freedom in the modern sense. The serf was legally unfree in that he could not leave the manor without permission and owed fixed dues and labor services to his lord. These obligations, corvée, labor, rents, and tithes were embedded in custom and law, backed by local courts and the lord's authority. Yet serfs also possessed certain rights and protections. They could cultivate plots for their own use, inherit land within the manor, marry with consent, and seek justice in manorial courts. This was not a free market relationship, but a reciprocal one. The lord provided protection from external threats, raids, famine, banditry, and maintained infrastructure such as mills and ovens. Serfs' fixed obligations gave them a measure of predictability. Though bound, they were entitled to subsistence and community. Their lives were largely local, their social identities tied to kinship and village. There was no expectation of mobility or consumer choice, but survival was more assured than in precarious times. In some regions, serfs could negotiate their burdens, purchase freedom, or even rise in status. The economic role of the serf was foundational to feudal society. They produced the food and goods necessary for lords, clergy, and townspeople. In exchange for their labor, they received security within a defined social order. Their obligations were rigid but clear. The framework of duties and rights created a social fabric that, while oppressive by modern standards, provided a kind of embeddedness and stability. Freedom was limited, but not absent. It existed within a web of mutual expectations. Contrast this with the experience of many modern wage laborers, especially in the globalized post-industrial economy. At first glance, the freedom to contract labor, choose employers, and move across cities or countries seems to represent a vast expansion of liberty. Yet for the growing precariat workers in insecure, low-wage, or gig economy jobs, the reality is often one of volatility and vulnerability. Unlike serfs, who knew the terms of their labor in advance, many modern workers face uncertain hours, fluctuating income, and little job security. Contracts are temporary, benefits scarce, and the threat of unemployment looms constantly. The rise of consumer debt further entangles workers in economic dependence. Mortgages, credit cards, and student loans create obligations that restrict choices and impose psychological burdens. The freedom to quit a job is often constrained by the need to repay debts or maintain health care. Moreover, algorithmic management and digital surveillance have introduced new mechanisms of control. Rideshare drivers, warehouse workers, and call center employees find their tasks monitored in real time by software that assigns work, measures productivity, and enforces discipline without human mediation. These invisible overseers leave little room for negotiation or recourse. The result is a system of control that is diffuse, impersonal, and relentless, a sharp departure from the personal authority of the medieval lord, whose power could at least be confronted or negotiated. The paradox deepens when considering social safety nets. Medieval serfs relied on customary support within communities and the manor. Today's workers may benefit from state programs, but these are often insufficient or precarious themselves. Welfare is tied to employment status, and many fall through the cracks of eligibility. Informal labor markets and the gig economy often lack protections altogether. Yet this is not to romanticize serfdom. The physical demands, limited medical knowledge, and social restrictions were severe. Serfs endured famines, epidemics, and harsh punishments. Their personal freedoms movement, speech, property were curtailed. They could not vote or influence political decisions. Their lives were circumscribed by rigid hierarchies, gender norms, and religious doctrines. Freedom, in the medieval sense, was limited and communal, framed by the manor and the church. Still, there was a certain clarity. Rights and duties were defined by law and custom, enforced by known authorities within reachable communities. Disputes were adjudicated locally. The serf's identity was embedded in place and tradition, with social roles that, while fixed, offered continuity. In contrast, modern workers often exist in fragmented social landscapes of anonymity, digital disconnect, and globalized labor markets that obscure relationships and responsibilities. This difference influences perceptions of freedom. The medieval serf might be seen as constrained by external forces, but embedded in a social matrix that gave meaning and identity. The modern wage slave, while formerly free, can experience alienation, precarity, and invisibility. The cost of freedom can be isolation and anxiety, not just opportunity. Historian Karl Polanyi described this transformation as the disembedding of the economy from social relations. The medieval economy was embedded in customs and social roles. The modern capitalist economy abstracts labor into a commodity bought and sold, detached from community. This abstraction can produce efficiency and growth, but risks eroding the social bonds that sustain freedom. Furthermore, the moral dimensions of work and freedom have shifted. Medieval labor was understood as a duty ordained by God and society. Freedom was bound up with fulfilling one's place in a divinely ordered hierarchy. Modern labor, in contrast, is often framed as a personal contract or market exchange. Freedom is seen as choice in a competitive arena. But this framework can obscure structural inequalities and dependencies. Debt, in particular, plays a crucial role in modern unfreedom, where serfs owed fixed dues often payable in labor or produce. Modern workers owe money that accumulates interest and demands continuous repayment. Debt binds not only bodies, but futures, limiting options and shaping behavior. The psychological impact of indebtedness creates a form of internal constraint, worry, stress, diminished agency that contrasts with the medieval social protections. The rise of consumer culture further complicates this picture. Whereas medieval serfs lived relatively austere lives, modern workers face constant pressure to consume, to appear successful, and to keep pace with shifting fashions. This cultural demand can deepen economic dependence, fostering cycles of credit and consumption that entangle freedom in new ways. In this context, comparisons between serfdom and wage labor highlight the ambiguous nature of modern liberty. Political enfranchisement and legal rights are necessary but not sufficient conditions for freedom. Economic security, social belonging, and meaningful autonomy matter deeply. When workers face unpredictable schedules, surveilled labor, and relentless economic pressure, their freedom can feel hollow. Labor movements and political struggles have long recognized this tension. The fight for an 8-hour day, workplace safety, union rights, and social welfare are efforts to reclaim freedom within capitalist systems. These struggles echo medieval communal protections, seeking to re-embed economic life within social relations and shared norms. The gig economy, meanwhile, exemplifies the challenges of the 21st century. Based work offers flexibility, but also isolation, lack of benefits, and algorithmic control. Workers are independent contractors on paper, but often functionally dependent. This blurring of employment status raises urgent questions about the nature of freedom in contemporary labor. At the same time, some modern workers exercise forms of agency unimaginable in the Middle Ages. The ability to change careers, access education, and organize collectively are achievements of political and social progress. Digital communication enables new forms of solidarity and resistance. The balance between freedom and constraint is complex, dynamic, and contested. Thus, the question of who is free, a medieval serf or modern wage slave, cannot be answered simplistically. Each embodies forms of constraint and autonomy shaped by historical context. The serf's freedom was bounded by place and custom, but supported by reciprocal obligations. The modern worker's freedom is broad in theory, but often circumscribed by economic insecurity and technological control. This tension invites us to rethink freedom not as a fixed state but as a spectrum of conditions, shaped by social, economic, and political forces. It also challenges us to recognize the ways modern capitalism produces new chains, even as it promises liberation. As the world changes rapidly, with automation, artificial intelligence, and global markets reshaping work, these questions become more urgent. The lessons of medieval serfdom remind us that freedom must be supported by community and security, not just choice. And the realities of modern labor warn us that freedom can be fragile, precarious, and easily lost. In the end, the exploration of serfdom and wage slavery deepens our understanding of liberty's paradoxes. It shows that freedom is not simply absence of bondage, but presence of conditions, material, social, and psychological, that allow human flourishing. Whether tethered to the manor or tied to an app, the quest for freedom continues to be shaped by forces both visible and invisible, ancient and modern. From the dawn of organized society, religion has woven itself tightly into the fabric of human experience, offering both a sanctuary for the spirit and a framework of control over bodies and minds. To approach religion solely as a source of oppression or solely as a path to liberation would be to misunderstand its complex duality. In ancient and modern contexts alike, religious institutions have operated as both chains and key structures that can restrict freedom even as they open doors to profound inner emancipation. The paradox lies in how faith can simultaneously impose orthodoxy and inspire rebellion, submission and sovereignty, conformity and transcendence. In the ancient world, religion was rarely a private affair. It permeated politics, law, social order, and daily routine. Temples towered over cities, priests wielded political power, and religious rituals marked every passage of life. The temple tax in ancient Egypt and later in Jerusalem, for example, was not merely a contribution but a compulsory levy that reinforced the prostitution's authority and its control over wealth and resources. This taxation served to bind populations economically and symbolically to religious hierarchies. Participation in state cults was often mandatory, embedding individuals within a religious political nexus that shaped identity and allegiance. But religious authority also extended far beyond taxation. It dictated morality, gender roles, and social hierarchies. The priesthood controlled knowledge of sacred texts and rituals, which were often secret or restricted. By monopolizing spiritual meaning, religious elites reinforced societal order, legitimizing rulers and justifying inequalities as divinely ordained. This dynamic limited personal freedom by imposing prescribed roles and beliefs. Dissent was dangerous. Heresy was punished by exile, imprisonment, or death. The intertwining of church and state power created a regime where deviation was not only social deviance but spiritual betrayal. Yet, alongside these institutions of orthodoxy, religious traditions also harbored currents of personal, spiritual freedom. Mystical rebels, prophets, and philosophers challenged established dogmas and pursued inward liberation. In the deserts of Egypt and Syria, ascetics renounced worldly attachments, seeking freedom from desire through solitude and discipline. Stoic philosophers taught mastery over passions, defining a kind of inner sovereignty that no external authority could take away. The Essenes practiced communal living and purity rites that set them apart from temple-centered Judaism, envisioning a spiritual freedom that transcended political control. The tension between institutional religion and personal faith was a source of profound paradox. In the Jewish tradition, Prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah condemned ritualism when it masked injustice, insisting that true devotion required ethical living and heartfelt connection to God. Similarly, early Christian communities faced persecution, precisely because their faith questioned imperial cults and hierarchical power. The message of personal salvation, resurrection, and spiritual equality before God was revolutionary, a key to freedom for the oppressed. Buddhism, emerging in India around the 6th century BCE, articulated this paradox in striking form. It rejected caste hierarchy and ritual sacrifice, proposing instead a path of individual enlightenment through meditation, ethical conduct, and detachment. The monastic order offered a refuge from worldly power and suffering, a place where internal freedom was paramount. Yet, as Buddhism institutionalized, monasteries accrued land and influence, and orthodox interpretations sometimes stifled dissent, revealing again the dual nature of religion as both chain and key in the Roman Empire. Religious plurality existed alongside imperial control. The state religion sought to unify the empire through shared cults and emperor worship, suppressing alternative beliefs, but mystery religions like those of Isis and Mithras promised personal initiation and secret knowledge, offering believers a sense of spiritual empowerment inaccessible in official rituals. Christianity's eventual triumph both institutionalized faith and made it a tool of imperial authority. But the tension between spiritual freedom and dogmatic control persisted. Fast forward to the medieval period, where the Catholic Church's dominion over Europe was near total. The Church regulated not only worship, but education, law, and social welfare. The doctrine of divine right reinforced monarchies, and the Inquisition policed belief. Heresy was a capital crime. Yet within this system, movements like the Beguines, and later the Franciscans, sought spiritual renewal and simplicity, often emphasizing direct experience of God over ecclesiastical mediation. Mysticism flourished, with figures like Julian of Norwich and Meister Eckhart advocating a personal union with the divine that transcended institutional constraints. This dynamic carried into the Reformation, where calls for direct access to Scripture and personal faith challenged the Catholic hierarchy. The printing press democratized religious knowledge, breaking the priesthood's monopoly. Protestantism's emphasis on individual conscience was both liberation and a new form of control. As orthodoxy fractured and new dogmas formed, religious freedom expanded in theory, but conflicts and persecutions persisted. In the modern era, secularization has complicated religion's role. Institutional faith no longer monopolizes political power in many societies, yet religious identities and beliefs remain deeply influential. The paradox endures. Religion can be a source of communal control, moral policing, and exclusion, but also a font of resilience, identity, and inner freedom. For many, spiritual practices provide a refuge from the alienation and fragmentation of modern life, offering meaning and connection beyond material conditions. Contemporary spiritual movements reflect this duality. New Age, meditation, and mindfulness practices borrow from ancient traditions to cultivate inner freedom and self-awareness. At the same time, organized religions continue to enforce doctrines that regulate gender, sexuality, and political allegiance. The rise of fundamentalism across faiths reveals how religion can become a fortress against modernity, resisting pluralism and personal autonomy. Moreover, religion's relationship with freedom varies widely across cultures. In some societies, Faith communities are vital sources of social support and political activism, advancing human rights and liberation theology. In others, religious institutions justify authoritarianism and restrict dissent. This ambivalence complicates simplistic judgments about religion's role in freedom. A key question emerges: how do individuals navigate this tension? The history of faith reveals strategies of negotiation, resistance, and reinterpretation. Believers may accept institutional structures while cultivating private spiritual lives. Mystics and reformers remind us that personal freedom within religion is not only possible but transformative. Psychologically, religious faith can create a profound sense of agency and peace, empowering adherents to endure hardship and transcend external circumstances. Practices of prayer, meditation, and ritual can foster self-discipline and detachment, echoing ancient philosophies of inner liberty. For many, the soul's sovereignty is the ultimate freedom, independent of earthly chains. Yet this freedom requires constant vigilance. Institutions may seek to contain spiritual expression, shaping belief to serve social or political ends. The line between devotion and control is porous, shifting with historical contexts. In examining religion as both chain and key, we confront a paradox at the heart of human freedom. The external forms of power temples, laws, dogmas often seek to limit autonomy, binding bodies and minds to tradition. But within those forms, the possibility of internal liberation persists, offering a sanctuary beyond oppression. This duality challenges modern assumptions that secularism alone guarantees freedom. It reminds us that the spiritual dimension remains vital to human experience and that freedom encompasses more than political or economic conditions. It involves the capacity to shape one's inner life and relationship to meaning. Ancient and modern faiths alike continue to wrestle with this tension, reflecting humanity's enduring quest to reconcile belonging with individuality, authority with autonomy. The dance of religion as chain and key remains unfinished, inviting each generation to explore its own balance. The notion of individualism as the hallmark of modern freedom feels self-evident in today's world. We celebrate personal choice, autonomy, and self-expression as the ultimate achievements of human progress. Yet this conception of selfhood is a relatively recent development in the long sweep of history. For most of human existence, identity was not a private possession but a shared and embedded reality rooted in family, tribe, city, or faith community. The birth of individualism, beginning in classical antiquity but exploding in the modern era, unmoored the self from these collective anchors, liberating, yes, but also isolating. It introduced new forms of captivity disguised as freedom. In the ancient world, the self was inseparable from the social matrix. The Greek polis, for example, did not recognize a fully autonomous individual in the modern sense. Citizenship entailed belonging to a community that shaped one's duties, rights, and identity. The notion of auto-self was not about separate existence, but about self-mastery within the context of civic virtue and social role. One was free insofar as one fulfilled obligations to the city and acted in accordance with shared norms. Similarly, family and tribe defined personhood. In Rome, persona derived from the mask worn in theatre, emphasizing roles one played in public life. The paterfamilias exercised authority over household members whose identities were defined religially. Honor, reputation, and status were collective, maintained through lineage and communal acknowledgement. The ancient self was a node in a web of obligations and expectations, not an isolated atom. Religious traditions reinforced this embedded selfhood. In Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the believer's identity was bound to a covenant community, defined by shared faith and practice. Salvation, meaning, and purpose were collective enterprises. The idea of a radically private self, independent of social and spiritual ties, was largely foreign. This embeddedness provided structure and meaning, but constrained individual desires and expressions. Roles were prescribed by birth, gender, class, and status. Mobility, social, geographic, intellectual, was limited. Freedom was understood as participation in communal life and adherence to cosmic or divine order. The gradual emergence of individualism began with philosophical currents in late antiquity and the Renaissance. Humanism placed the individual at the center of inquiry, emphasizing reason, creativity, and personal dignity. The rediscovery of classical texts, the rise of secular thought, and expanding literacy nurtured self-awareness as a distinct dimension of existence. The Protestant Reformation accelerated this shift by emphasizing personal faith and conscience over institutional mediation. The printing press allowed individuals to access scripture, encouraging direct engagement with texts and questioning of authority. The self became a subject of reflection, responsibility, and choice. The scientific revolution and enlightenment further unmoored identity from tradition. Empiricism and reason championed observation and skepticism, displacing reliance on inherited wisdom. Political philosophies of Locke, Rousseau, and others articulated individual rights and social contracts, positing freedom as natural and inalienable. Yet with this liberation came atomization. The modern self is often imagined as a sovereign, self-contained entity responsible for its own fate in an indifferent universe. This autonomy fosters innovation, diversity, and empowerment, but also engenders loneliness, anxiety, and fragmentation. The rise of capitalism deepened this dynamic. Economic relations became impersonal, contractual, and competitive. Social bonds weakened as individuals navigated markets rather than kinship networks. The family transformed from a production unit to a site of emotional support amid economic uncertainty. Industrialization uprooted millions from traditional communities, thrusting them into urban anonymity. Political enfranchisement expanded, but social solidarity was often thin. The modern self must constantly negotiate identity, meaning, and belonging in rapidly changing contexts. Philosophers from Kierkegaard to Sartre wrestled with this paradox. Existentialism exposed the burdens of freedom, the anguish of choice, the absurdity of existence without given meaning. The isolated self effaces both the gift and curse of liberty, the responsibility to define itself without fixed anchors. Psychoanalytic theories illuminated the fractured self, shaped by unconscious drives, social conditioning, and internal conflicts. Modern psychology reveals that freedom of choice is entangled with constraints of desire, fear, and societal norms. The self is neither pure nor fully free, but shaped by forces often beyond awareness. Contemporary society amplifies these tensions. Digital technologies create new forms of connection, but also surveillance and commodification of identity. Social media fragments attention and fosters curated selves, challenging authentic selfhood. Consumer culture promotes endless self-invention, but can deepen dissatisfaction and alienation. Mental health crises highlight the costs of individualism. Depression, anxiety, and loneliness rise amid social disconnection and economic precarity. The promise of freedom through self-expression often collides with the reality of isolation and systemic inequality. Yet individualism is not solely a prison. It enables political rights, gender equality, sexual liberation, and cultural diversity. The recognition of personal dignity underpins human rights and social justice movements. Selfhood can be a source of creativity, resilience, and transformation. The challenge is to balance autonomy with belonging, freedom with responsibility. Philosophers and social critics propose relational selves or interdependent autonomy that acknowledge embeddedness while affirming agency. Communities, traditions, and institutions can nurture individuality without suffocating it. Educational and political systems struggle with this balance. The cultivation of critical thinking and personal development must be matched by fostering empathy, solidarity, and civic engagement. The risk of atomization demands renewed attention to social bonds and collective purpose. Historical perspectives remind us that the modern self's solitude is neither natural nor inevitable, but constructed and contingent. The embedded self of antiquity offered security and identity, but limited freedom. The liberated self of modernity offers choice and dignity, but can entail alienation. In this light, the birth of individualism emerges as a double-edged sword, a new form of prison in the guise of liberation. The self, freed from collective constraints, must now confront the task of self-creation amid uncertainty and fragmentation. This paradox challenges us to rethink freedom not as mere independence, but as a dynamic balance of self and society. In conclusion, the evolution of selfhood from embeddedness to atomization reframes the question of freedom itself. True liberty may not be the absence of ties, but the presence of meaningful connections that enable self-realization. The modern self's quest for freedom is ongoing, shaped by tensions between isolation and community, choice and constraint, individuality and belonging. From the earliest days of civilization, societies have sought to enforce order through the regulation of bodies. Punishment, whether swift, brutal, public, or hidden, has served as a crucial mechanism of control, shaping not only behavior, but conceptions of justice, power, and freedom. When we glance back at ancient systems of justice, we see a world where physical suffering was visible and immediate, flogging, branding, exile, and death enacted before crowds. Today, punishment has become more obscured behind legal bureaucracy, incarceration, and digital surveillance. Raising a profound question, have we simply replaced tangible chains with invisible ones? In the ancient world, justice was a spectacle, deeply woven into communal life. Cities like Athens, Rome, and Babylon held punishments in public spaces to demonstrate the consequences of transgression and reinforce social hierarchies. Flogging was common for theft or disobedience, a physical reminder of submission to law. The lash tore flesh as much as it tore down the offender's status, visible to neighbors and kin. Embedding discipline within collective memory, exile, too, was a powerful tool. To banish a citizen from the polis or tribal land was to sever social ties, the very lifeblood of identity and survival. In a world without modern social services, exile often meant death or destitution, the ultimate punishment. Ancient legal codes like the Code of Hammurabi detailed precise penalties, from mutilation to monetary fines, all inscribed publicly to assert the authority of rulers. Crucially, these punishments were not only physical but theatrical. The Roman practice of damnatio ad bestias, condemning criminals to die by wild animals, combined law enforcement with entertainment, merging state power with crowd control. Public executions served to awe the populace, deter crime, and display the ruler's might. The visibility of punishment was a form of social pedagogy, teaching citizens their place in the order. Yet these visible chains came with social context. Punishment was often governed by custom and ritual, integrating the offender back into community after penance. Ancient Greece's system of ostracism, for example, temporarily removed dangerous individuals but preserved civic cohesion. Even brutal penalties were embedded in frameworks that valued honor, repentance, and restoration. Transitioning to modernity, we see a profound transformation in the form and visibility of punishment. Public executions and corporal punishment gave way to the rise of prisons and institutions designed to isolate offenders, impose order, and reform behavior away from public eyes. This shift, prominent from the 17th century onward, reflects changing attitudes toward the body, sovereignty, and control. The philosopher Michel Foucault famously analyzed this transition as the movement from sovereign power exercised through spectacle to disciplinary power exercised through surveillance. The panopticon, an architectural model of constant observation, symbolizes this shift. Instead of physical chains and public shame, modern justice employs legal bureaucracy, prisons, and surveillance to produce docile bodies. Prisons, while intended as spaces of reform, often reproduce social inequalities and extend state control. The vast growth of incarceration in the modern era, especially in countries like the States, drives how punishment has become more diffuse and systemic. Rather than visible torture, prisoners endure confinement, isolation, and deprivation. Within opaque institutions, the psychological impact of incarceration can be profound, eroding autonomy and selfhood. Legal bureaucracy, with its complex codes, procedures, and endless paperwork, creates layers of control that can overwhelm defendants and citizens. The impersonal nature of courts and parole systems distances individuals from decision-makers, diminishing transparency and agency. Justice becomes a maze of rules rather than a direct social negotiation. Digital criminalization adds a new dimension to this evolution. In the 21st century, algorithms monitor online behavior, predict risks, and allocate punishments in ways often invisible and unchallengeable. Data mining, facial recognition, and AI-based sentencing threaten to reproduce biases and expand surveillance. Beyond physical spaces, the chains have become immaterial yet no less binding. Yet the persistence of physical punishment in many parts of the world reminds us that visible chains have not entirely vanished. Corporal punishment, flogging, and public humiliation continue in some legal systems, underscoring global disparities in justice. The coexistence of ancient and modern methods complicates narratives of progress. Examining these shifts, we confront the paradox of freedom in punishment. Visible suffering publicly demonstrated power but allowed communal participation and recognition. Invisible chains operate in silence, obscuring mechanisms of control and potentially increasing alienation. Furthermore, the racialized and class-based dimensions of punishment persist across eras. Ancient laws often protected elites while punishing marginalized groups more harshly. Modern incarceration disproportionately affects minorities and the poor, reflecting continuities in social control masked by legal formalism. The modern emphasis on rehabilitation also wrestles with freedom's limits. Prisons promise reform, but often fail to address root causes of crime, poverty, trauma, inequality, trapping bodies and minds in cycles of confinement. The freedom to serve sentences is illusory when basic human needs and dignity are denied. Technology amplifies these dilemmas. Predictive policing and electronic monitoring extend state power into everyday life, raising questions about consent and justice. Surveillance blurs boundaries between punishment and preemptive control, challenging legal protections. At the same time, new forms of resistance echo ancient defiance. Prisoner uprisings, activist movements, and restorative justice efforts seek to reclaim autonomy and transform punitive systems. They invoke justice as liberation rather than mere control. The history of punishment reveals that freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of dignity, agency, and social recognition, visible and invisible, corporal and bureaucratic, ancient and modern. These chains shape lives profoundly. Reflecting on bodies in chains invites a reconsideration of justice itself. Is punishment a tool for protection, reparation, or domination? Can justice coexist with freedom when it entails confinement and surveillance? These questions remain urgent as societies grapple with reform and human rights. Ultimately, the transition from flogging to digital monitoring is not simply progress, but a complex transformation of power. Chains have changed shape but not disappeared. The challenge lies in envisioning systems that uphold safety without sacrificing humanity or liberty. Throughout human history, the vision of a perfect society, whether an idealized paradise or a cautionary nightmare, has been a powerful tool for imagining freedom and control. Ancient cultures left us blueprints of utopias and dystopias that reveal their deepest hopes, fears, and understandings of liberty. These early imaginings continue to echo in modern ideological landscapes, where visions of liberation often carry the seeds of domination. By exploring foundational texts such as Plato's Republic, Taoist writings, Hesiod's Golden Age myths, and Jewish messianic expectations, we can trace how the tension between emancipation and control has shaped both ancient and contemporary conceptions of freedom. Plato's Republic stands as perhaps the most influential ancient blueprint for a just society. Written in the 4th century BCE, it outlines a hierarchical, philosopher-ruled polis, in which each class performs its designated function. Justice, for Plato, is harmony among the class's rulers, auxiliaries, and producers, each subordinating individual desires for the common good. The Republic's vision of freedom is paradoxical. True liberty is found in accepting one's place within the rigid social order. The ideal city suppresses personal ambition and private property among the guardian class, aiming for unity and stability. The Republic also introduces the famous allegory of the cave, illustrating how knowledge liberates the soul from ignorance, but burdens it with responsibility. Philosophers, having glimpsed the forms, must return to rule even at personal cost. This conception of freedom is thus linked to duty and the restraint of individual desires for a transcendent ideal. Yet Plato's utopia can be read as dystopian from another angle. The strict caste system, censorship, and communal family structures curtail personal freedom and diversity. Critics argue it anticipates authoritarian regimes that prioritize order over individual rights. The tension between collective harmony and personal liberty remains unresolved. Meanwhile, far to the east, Taoist texts such as the Tao Te Ching offer a radically different vision. Emerging in the 6th century BCE, Taoism celebrates spontaneity, naturalness, and non-action wu wei. Its utopia is not a constructed city, but a harmonious return to the simplicity and fluidity of the Tao, a fundamental principle underlying all existence. Freedom here means surrender to natural rhythms, abandoning desires and distinctions. Taoist sages envision rulers who govern least, allowing people to live unburdened by laws and artificial hierarchies. The ideal society resembles a pastoral, the landscape where people are content, few laws exist, and weapons gather dust. This vision critiques the heavy-handed control of states, offering liberation through detachment and humility. However, Taoism's utopia also challenges conventional freedom by urging self-effacement and the dissolution of the ego. Individualism gives way to unity with the whole. The paradox lies in freedom through loss of self contrasting sharply with Western notions of autonomous subjectivity. Hesiod's Works and Days, composed in the 8th century BCE, introduces the myth of the Golden Age, a distant era when humans lived free from toil, disease, and war. This age of innocence was ruled by gods who nurtured humanity, granting them effortless abundance and peace. The Golden Age is a nostalgic, utopian, unreachable past rather than a future project. The myth reflects a longing for lost harmony and freedom from suffering. Yet it also warns of decline as humans lose favor with the gods and descend into toil and conflict. This cyclical view of history implies that freedom is fragile and contingent on divine will and moral order. Jewish messianic hopes, as expressed in prophetic texts like Isaiah, project a future utopia of justice, peace, and liberation from oppression. The Messiah's arrival promises the restoration of Israel and universal harmony, overturning earthly tyranny. This vision inspired resilience under exile and persecution, fueling movements for spiritual and political freedom. Yet messianic utopias carry paradoxes as well. They often envision a divinely ordained order that can justify exclusion or violence against enemies. The promise of liberation is intertwined with obedience to divine law and the subordination of individual will to sacred purpose. These ancient imaginings of utopia and dystopia are not mere fantasies, but frameworks through which societies articulated ideals of freedom and control. They reveal competing values: order versus liberty, unity versus diversity, selfhood versus community, transcendence versus immanence. In modern times, these motifs reappear in ideological promises ranging from communism to liberal democracy, from technocratic governance to spiritual movements. The dream of a perfect society continues to inspire but also to warn. Totalizing visions risk authoritarianism. Fragmented freedoms risk chaos. The dialectic of utopia and dystopia thus reflects the paradox of freedom itself. Every ideal contains seeds of its opposite. Every promise of liberation entails potential domination. Ancient texts invite us to confront these tensions without illusions. They remind us that freedom is always shaped by history, culture, and power. The challenge is to pursue visions of justice that respect pluralism, dignity, and agency, avoiding both rigid control and nihilistic fragmentation. In reflecting on ancient blueprints, we also recognize the enduring human capacity to imagine beyond constraints, to aspire to worlds better than the present. This imaginative freedom sustains hope even amid struggle. At the same time, these texts caution humility. Utopian ambitions must reckon with complexity, unintended consequences, and the limits of human design. The tension between liberation and Order is not resolvable by simple formulas, but requires ongoing negotiation. Thus, ancient utopias and dystopias remain vital resources for understanding freedom's paradoxes. They invite us to think critically about the futures we build and the chains we forge in pursuit of ideals. Throughout this exploration, we have traced the elusive contours of freedom across time, peeling back layers of history to reveal its many faces. Political liberty, spiritual emancipation, economic autonomy, and bodily self-determination have all played parts in a vast and shifting mosaic. Ancient societies, with their tribes and city-states, religious rites and social orders, offer surprising glimpses of freedoms that differ profoundly from those we cherish today. The paradox remains: while modern society boasts unprecedented rights and choices, it may be less free in spirit, community, and meaning than some of the worlds that preceded it. The political freedoms celebrated in contemporary democracies, suffrage, legal protections, freedom of speech, stand as monumental achievements. They emerged through centuries of struggle, philosophy, and social evolution, displacing autocracies, monarchies, and rigid castes. Yet, when juxtaposed with the embedded civic participation of classical Athens or the decentralized autonomy of tribal peoples, modern freedom reveals complex trade-offs. Ancient citizens might have lacked universal rights, but some experienced profound forms of political agency tied to their roles and communal obligations, entwined with a shared sense of belonging that is difficult to replicate in the anonymity of modern states. Similarly, economic freedom, often defined by wage, labor, and market choice, appears as a double-edged sword. The serfs of medieval Europe, bound by fixed obligations but secured within stable social orders, contrast with today's precariat, who navigate precarious employment, debt, and algorithmic oversight. Modern economic liberty can thus entail subtle forms of captivity, where the illusion of choice masks structural constraints and dependency. Ancient systems of slavery, though brutal and dehumanizing, sometimes allowed for agency and upward mobility in ways not dissimilar to modern economic survival strategies. Complicating simplistic comparisons, spiritual freedom, a realm of inward liberty explored by Stoics, Buddhists, and mystics, offers another dimension often overlooked in modern secular frameworks: the ancient pursuit of inner sovereignty from external chains, mastery over desire. Union with the divine remains a powerful form of freedom that transcends political and economic status, while modernity often prioritizes external autonomy. It can neglect this inner dimension, leaving individuals alienated despite formal liberties. The body itself has been a battleground for freedom across eras. Ancient punishments, visible and public, imposed physical suffering, yet maintained social bonds and public accountability. Modern incarceration and digital surveillance may hide chains, but extend control in more insidious ways. The struggle over bodily freedom, from slavery to imprisonment, from ritual to repression, continues as a core question of what it means to be truly free. These threads, political, spiritual, economic, and bodily, interweave in ways that defy simple categorization. Freedom is not a fixed state, but a dynamic negotiation between individual and collective, external conditions and internal states, past and present. The ancient world challenges modern assumptions, inviting us to consider that liberty is multidimensional and sometimes found in unexpected forms. The shadows of past liberties haunt us in subtle ways. The embeddedness of ancient selfhood in tribe, and Polis suggests that belonging and identity are central to freedom, not merely rights or choices. The communal surveillance of ancient cities reminds us that privacy and publicness have long been contested spaces. The spiritual disciplines of old offer resources for inner peace amid external turmoil. The stories of slaves and serfs reveal resilience and agency amid oppression, questioning modern ideas of freedom. Our contemporary moment, with its technological marvels and global interconnections, presents new possibilities and new challenges. Digital tools can empower voices, but also surveil and manipulate. Political rights coexist with polarization and disenchantment. Economic markets generate wealth alongside precarity. Spiritual quests persist amid secularization and fragmentation. In reflecting on freedom's shifting face, we confront uncomfortable questions. Is our celebrated liberty also a new form of captivity? Have we sacrificed soul and community on the altar of individualism and progress? The past does not offer simple answers, but provides perspectives that enrich our understanding and caution. Against hubris, the journey through ancient societies and their paradoxical freedoms reminds us that freedom is a living concept, fluid, contested, and deeply human. It is a process rather than a possession, shaped by history, culture, and power. Recognizing this complexity opens space for renewed dialogue about how to cultivate freedom in all its dimensions. As we move forward, the challenge is to balance rights with relationships, choice with meaning, autonomy with belonging. Freedom's true face may not be found in legal codes or markets alone, but in the ways individuals and communities nurture dignity, purpose, and connection. The ancient echoes that whisper through ruins and texts invite us to listen closely to see freedom, not as a static achievement, but as a continual striving, a delicate dance between chains and keys, shadows and light.